Check, check. Mic check, mic check. Okay. Okay? All right.
Alrighty, hello, welcome, good morning. Thank you everyone for coming out today and everyone who's joining us on the live stream. So I don't have too much to say at the beginning here. One thing is later you'll have a chance to ask questions, and because we're recording, we ask that you wait until I pass you the mic to ask your questions so we make sure we get it recorded on the video. Other than that, I think Anne has an introduction for herself, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Anne Krook.
All right, thank you so much. Let's make sure we are on. Okay, so the reason I do this and other versions of this presentation is that a lot of graduate students, particularly those in PhD programs, come to graduate school hoping for academic jobs. There are fewer of those academic jobs available than many people would like, and so many of you are going to end up doing non-academic job searches. The thing about them is those are different from the ones you may have been trained to do and from the ones your faculty supervisors know how to do. But my goal is at the end of this session, when you walk out the door, you will be able to conduct a non-academic job search if you want or need to. So, here's what we're going to do today. We have 2.5 to 3 hours. I think we're scheduled to noon. Is that correct? Okay. And that includes plenty of time for questions, so I'm counting on you to not be shy. You should feel free to take notes via phone photos and to tweet or post about the session. I am going to be sending a PDF of these slides and templates of the exercise and a resume that I will show you. So you will be able to see this afterwards without having to sort of frantically capture it all. So here's the structure of what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about graduate training and the non-academic job market, how employers like me think about people like you. I'm going to talk about what you can do to prepare yourself during your graduate program so that you're well set up for a job search. And then the last of the long sections, I'm going to talk about the mechanics of a job search, how to actually do it. And then I have 3 very brief sections at the end, what you should do right now to start. I have some resources for you and some reminders. Okay, so graduate training in the non-academic job market. So the first part of it is about me. And then the next part of it is about, generically speaking, you, how employers look at people like you. So, my career path. I am a faculty brat. My father taught veterinary medicine at Cornell for, 100 years. And I went right from secondary school to college to graduate school, and then signed on as an assistant professor. So I was an assistant professor at 26. Then I was a bartender. I switched into technology. I was at Amazon for a bunch of years, starting in the very early days. I did the small startup thing. I was at a medium-sized product design engineering firm. And now I'm chair of the board of directors at Lambda Legal, which is a nonprofit, and I'm a consultant and an author doing talks like this one. So that's a lot of change. So here's how I made some of them. Faculty member to bartender. So this was an involuntary change because I got fired. I didn't get tenure, and I needed a job. So I got a bartender's license and tended bar. This is the one most people are interested in, getting to Amazon from being a bartender. I talked to a friend of mine who I'd played softball with in graduate school, and he said, oh yeah, there's this new startup and they sell books. You read a lot of books, you should talk to them. And it was, the introduction to Amazon was not more sophisticated than that. So when I interviewed there, we had a long talk about my skills, but not very much about my credentials. Because honestly, no one at Amazon was hanging out a sign saying, wanted former assistant professors, right? That's not how life works. Or not so far. Lambda Legal. So I started as a donor. a small-time donor, and I hated their web properties. I hated their website, I hated their Facebook feed. They launched a Twitter feed, and I hated that too, and I complained about it constantly. And then when I was getting ready to leave Amazon, someone said to me, you know, Anne, if you hate it so much, you can do something about that. So I consulted with them pro bono to get their web properties better. And as a result, I was invited to join the board of directors, and I've recently been elected chair. So what do we learn from this? This is an incredibly important piece of thing to learn, especially for people in PhD programs. Many, many jobs do not require a credential, but all jobs require skills. We hope the person at the front of the airplane has a pilot's license, and we hope the people operating on you in operating theaters have an MD, but most jobs are not like that. All jobs require skills, but not everything requires a credential. So you're probably going to be looking for jobs where a master's or a PhD is not necessarily a requirement. Here's the thing I knew least well because I was a faculty brat and because I went right into university work. The non-academic work world is awesome. There's a lot of really interesting work out there, and you don't always know what you could be doing, especially if you did what I did and went right from secondary school to college to your graduate work. But the other important thing is that you may spend part of your career in fields that don't exist now. When I graduated from college, the internet was at its very basic early stages, and there was no question of buying things on it. But I spent 13 years at Amazon, which was not something I could have envisioned. Now, here's another thing that is different from how to engage with work than many of you may have experienced. There's a lot of ways to learn things. Your interests, not just your training, can lead to a job. And if you complain about it, ask if you can help fix it. No one has yet taken me up on this to the cable companies, but one day at one of these presentations, someone is going to fix that. But think about that. Think about the things that you care enough to complain about. I just did this presentation at UBC, and there was a student session afterwards. I was talking to the faculty, but there was a student session afterwards, and a number of students said to the moderator, someone should fix this. And finally, she said to them, be to someone, right? And that can be you. And then finally, it is possible to get a great academic job and still need to change jobs. I got the best job of my year, and then 6 years later, I was looking for work. Now, so that was me. Now I'm going to talk about myself as an employer. What do I think, and what do people like me think when we look at people like you? If you're looking for work in a related field, a PhD or a master's can be a good thing because it says, okay, you've got this commitment to advanced training, and it might be an advantage. But a lot of you are going to look for jobs that are quite far out afield from your training. And if you go looking for work in an unrelated or a distantly related field, your graduate training is neither an advantage nor a disadvantage. What it is a choice you made about how to spend a lot of time and a lot of opportunity cost, and that's what you're going to need to explain, including why you finished your thesis, if you did, and why you didn't, if you don't. Those both have great explanations, but you will need to know how to make them. Now, here are some of the things that I like to find in people with graduate training. A lot of us look at really persistent, difficult problems in new ways. If I were to say a single thing about why people come to graduate school, it's this, right? There are these problems out there. We've got to figure out how to solve them. Let's look at them in some different way. People who have been to graduate school believe that other people have things to teach us. at the core, we have spent enough time in school that we believe in what it does. And as a result of that, we value collegiality, right? We all know who in seminars is good and fun to talk to and helps you understand the material, and who doesn't. And the former are the people that we generally call collegial. And then finally, we realize that explaining some things is hard and learning some things is hard. And so when you go into the workplace and you're working with a group of people, people who have spent time in graduate school tend to be a little bit better at explaining things because they tend to think that's something they're going to have to do. So all of these traits, I find, of people who've had graduate training tend to make really good employees. You got it? Okay. Now, here is the dark side of the force. Here are bad traits of some job candidates with graduate training. There are people who have a narrow view of intelligence, particularly people like me who started as a faculty brat and who grew up into it and who knew nothing else. And I gotta tell you, that really sells other types of intelligence short, right? There's a lot of different kinds of intelligence out there, and not all of it succeeds at school. Most of you guys are old enough now that you know somebody who actually did not do all that well in school, but is now doing really well in the work world. Now, some people believe, especially PhD folks, that rewarding work has to be related to academic work and workplaces. And that really sells other kinds of jobs short, right? And this was kind of me, right? Because when I left academics, I thought, well, I could be an editor, I could be a teacher, I could, work at a university. And you can do that, and those are all awesome jobs. But there are many awesome jobs out there, and don't sell them short. And then finally, this is a tough trait, but one I screen for because I don't want to hire these people. Some people think that taking other kinds of jobs means not using your degrees, and they get very resentful about that. I am here to tell you that you will never, ever not use your degrees, no matter what field you go into. Your training is part of you. It's your habit of mind, it's how you think, it's how you approach problems, and it's how you approach people. Do not sell yourself short in this way. And I say this too, my father emigrated to the United States. And I say this because there is particularly a lot of pressure on the children of immigrants when they get degrees to use them, and that most often means in universities. And it's hard to explain to immigrant parents, particularly to mine, who was in fact a faculty member, what you're doing and why it's different. But don't sell yourself short in this way. You will be using your degrees for the rest of your life. Now, here are how some of my former students and my former colleagues are currently using their degrees. And I want to talk about one of those jobs in particular, which is the faculty member and director of study abroad. This is a former student of mine who really loves traveling. And like many of us in academics, was not exactly overwhelmed with money. And so what she did is when the spring semester ended, she taught, those 3-week courses overseas where you teach an intensive course in art history or literature or something like that. And then she would travel after that. And so she would take groups of about 30 students from her institution and go traveling. And what happened over the course of doing that for 10 years is that she learned a lot of stuff. She already knew how to teach. I had taught her. But she learned, for example, what happens when one of the people you have on the course gets intoxicated and goes up to those, those guards in Britain with the tall bear hats, and throws up on his feet. And what happens when one of your students propositions the ambassador's daughter and she's not happy, right? And so she learned a lot of those kinds of things. Well, time passed and the director of that program retired, and she was invited to apply for the job. And she got the job, and it's now about 2/3 of what she does. And the important thing here for me are two pieces of advice for you. One is that she didn't realize she was developing skills as she was doing this job. She thought of what she was doing as getting to the end of the day alive, right? But she didn't think of it as developing skills. And the second thing is she didn't even know this was a job. Like when she started out in the workforce, she wasn't aware that this was one of the options on offer, right? And the workplace is like that. When you get out there, you find that there are all kinds of jobs that are really interesting that you could get. And they are more numerous than you might think. So, the rest of this, the bulk of the time for this session is going to be talking about these points. Here is what is important for you to do as you go out on the non-academic job market. One is to absolutely believe that interesting work and jobs are waiting for you. Focus on describing your skills, not primarily your credentials. And this will have implications for how you talk about yourself, implications for how you shape a resume, and implications for how you approach employers. You will need to broaden the range of people you seek out for help. You will need to treat everyone you meet along the way as a colleague. One of the things that I actively do not like about academics is that there are relatively few people who can help you get a job, right? If you don't have a good letter from your supervisor, it's much more difficult. But in the non-academic job search, there's lots of people who can help you get a job. And so it's important to treat everyone well along the way. Finally, here is the core message. Your message to an employer is this: my skills can help solve your challenges. Not, I have a PhD or a master's or whatever. My skills can help solve your challenges. This is about shifting your mentality so you can show an employer how you can help them. Now, before I go on to how you can prepare yourself, let me stop and take questions. And make sure you raise your hand, just because for the people live streaming, we need to get a mic out to you. Any of you have questions? All right. So, what can you do where you are right now, before you go on the market, as you're just getting ready in graduate school? The number one thing is to broaden your self-description, to find people to help your job search, and then there's a variety of things you need to do to prepare yourself mentally. And I'm going to go through each of these things in turn. Now, your current self-description. I assume it is something like this, right? Particularly for folks in PhD programs, but also for people in master's programs. Your knowledge is your subject, it's scholarship and your research, and your skills are research, writing, and teaching. I want you also to think this about yourself. Your knowledge and your skills come from all your previous and your current jobs and organizations, and your skills, abstracted from your current position, right, include your ability to add to your knowledge base quickly, to identify problems, to rethink solutions, and persuade other people to adopt them. And I'll stop here for a brief rant about transferable skills. That's not a term I believe in. I don't think transferable skills are things you get at one place and magically massage into another. I think skills are skills. You get skills wherever you go, and they are useful, and you have to adapt to all new workplaces because you have to adapt, because that's what successful organisms do. But don't think of yourself as having transferable skills, because that makes to seem to root them in academia as their proper place. Think of yourself as having skills. Okay, end of rant. Now, once you have broadened how you think about yourself, you have to change how you describe yourself. I assume your self-description looks something like this, right? I am a graduate student or postdoc in this field. I have an expertise in this. I am an experienced researcher. I have done this and that. I am a scholar. I've presented this and that. I am in training to become a faculty member. Many people internalize all of that as this is who I am. Here's, though, how I suggest you describe yourself in broader ways, and the academic equivalent is in blue. I complete large projects with minimal supervision. You have no idea how valuable this is. I am hiring people because I don't have time to do whatever it is I want them to do. And I can't supervise every minute of every day, because if I could do that, I'd do the work. I have worked in large organizations and medium-sized organizations within the enterprise. The gentlemen have been telling us for years that size matters. And I am here to tell you that at some level, it kind of does, in that we all know people who are comfortable in small groups but not big ones. We all know people who need big stages to shine on but who are not so great one-on-one, who seem a little loud. It is really important that you be self-aware about the kind and the size of groups where you work well. I have participated in and led small teams within the enterprise. One of the common questions I get is, oh my God, they're asking for leadership or management experience. I don't have any. You know, it's been my experience that most graduate students actually kind of do, because they've been in student organizations, or they've led TA teams, or they've led lab teams. But most of you have at least some leadership experience. You may not be thinking of it that way. I use research and analytical skills to identify problems, right? Any proposal is an incredibly valuable workplace skill, especially for people proposing new projects. I manage contentious discussions toward productive conclusions, right? If you've been in any seminar ever. And I was recommended for my first promotion at Amazon after I led a particularly annoying meeting. And about 10 minutes into the meeting, I realized, oh my God, they're acting like sophomores. And it's like, I understand now. And I changed how I was running the meeting. And teaching people to get through discussions to somewhere is an extraordinarily valuable skill. I persuade reluctant adopters to accept and deploy standards. If you have taught any introductory course of any kind anywhere, there's an entire genre of jobs out there that is about showing people, here are the standards of this profession, here is why you have to adopt them, and here is how you do it. Teaching at an introductory level is both exhilarating and it can be incredibly frustrating. I'm here to tell you it's a very valuable skill. So a better internalization than this is who I am is this is what I do. Because that will help you think about yourself when you go out to other kinds of workplaces. So, you have changed how you think about yourself. You have changed how you talk about yourself. Now you need the right vehicle for presenting that to other people on the non-academic job search. And this is the difference between a CV and a resume. A CV is written in academic shorthand, right? And it's typically evaluated by skilled readers, and it's entirely comprehensive. You put absolutely everything of your academic career in a CV. When I was an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, I was on 2 job searches, and we got, hundreds of applications, and I knew exactly how to read them, because I knew what people's undergraduate training meant, and I knew what their graduate schools were like, and I knew what their publications meant. And I was the least experienced person on the job committee, right? So professionals were reading that. A resume, on the other hand, is different, right? It's written and it's read by people who may not know how to read CVs, and I'm here to tell you they almost certainly do not care. What they need to know is what you can do to help solve their problems. It also may initially be evaluated by entry-level employees or by software. So you can't count on the reader of your resume to know as much about your stuff as you do. And above all, a resume is selective, right? A CV has absolutely everything. And when I coach graduate students, one of the hard things I sometimes have to do is help them choose about their resumes, because they really don't want to choose, right? They want to say, what if that thing that I put in, that I don't put in, is the thing that would have gotten me the job? And it's like, well, that's your job to figure it out up front. And we'll talk about that. So here's what you do to write a resume. You gather information from your entire work history, and I'm going to give you a template to show you how to do that. And you describe your jobs and your achievements and your skills. So, how do you do that? First, something about graduate school. Graduate school rewards a narrow focus. You have to forget all kinds of things about yourself to complete your graduate work. You have to become, in some ways, less rich and less interesting, right? You have to forget all those hobbies you used to have time for, and all those people you used to talk to, and all that music you used to listen to, because you're focused on what you're focused on. And that's how we all get through graduate school, right? This is not a failure. This is normal. But non-academic job searches, on the other hand, reward a broad focus. So to create a resume, what you have to do is you have to remember where you lived and what you did. And you have to define, sort, and count the skills you got from all those experiences. And I'll walk you through how to do this. In that process, that process will remind you what you know, which is more than you think. One of the hard psychological things about graduate school is that it's another one of those leaps. You know, when you go from high school to college, and all of a sudden you think, ooh, I don't know as much as I thought I did. And then you go from university to graduate school, and you think, oh, I don't know anything at all, right? And that is actually both not true and not a healthy approach for the job market. Because what you need to do is define what you know how to do, because that's what's going to help an employer. And this will also help create a rudimentary skills database out of which you build a resume. So that's what this is for, and now I'll show you how I do it. Okay. All right. So this is a template exercise. Calling it a tool is a sort of dressed up way of saying it's an Excel spreadsheet. And these are the instructions. So the very first thing I ask you to do is to remember the things about yourself that graduate school has taught you to forget. And so what I have put up here is a list of the way people organize their lives and their memories, right? Where they lived, where they went to school, where they've traveled, languages they speak, teams, organizations, lessons. There's a column there for jobs, and other characteristics about yourself. Now, I gotta say, I find descriptions of tools uninspiring at best and unhelpful at worst. So I filled this out for myself, so you can see what it looks like for an actual live human being. And I urge you to go right back to the beginning. Like, remember all that stuff about you, and remember all that stuff about jobs and volunteering you did. And what I mean, by the way, by certified volunteering is not a one-off, but something where you routinely have to show up. Now, the first time I ever did this exercise at a university, somebody said to me, yeah, Anne, but you're senior. What about us, right? And that was a reasonable remark. So what I did here, everything in the thick red type happened after I left graduate school. So the lesson for you guys should be, is that all the characteristics I had that I took when I went out onto the non-academic job market were present when I was sitting where you are now. And I want this to give you confidence, because it is not just the fact that I am 56 years old and relatively senior that gets me hired to do certain kinds of things. You guys can also get jobs, and you have the skills as well. Now, it takes, in my experience, about 2 one-hour sessions to do this spreadsheet, and it is very helpful if in between them you can get it to like a sibling or an old friend, and somebody outside of graduate school. Because again, graduate school has taught you to forget, and I am requiring that you remember. So in my experience, this takes about 2 sessions of about an hour each. So then, once you have remembered stuff, you take it in the ugly Excel salmon color there, and then you copy it over to a spreadsheet where you then describe what you did in each of those jobs. Because as we all know, you have lots of roles at different jobs, and you got lots of skills there. So here's what mine looks like, and I will go down to something close to where you are now. Oh, teaching assistant, look at that. So here are all the things that I think I really learned when I was a teaching assistant, right? Interpreting the non-obvious, time management, I wrote a syllabus, clear written explanations, clear oral explanations. I want to focus on that last one, the engagement of the disparately skilled. When students come into your classes or labs or wherever, they have different levels of interest, talent, education, experience, and intelligence. But you have to teach all of them. Workplaces are like this. People come into your project with different levels of experience and interests, and if you're the engineer and you get assigned a finance guy and the finance guy doesn't necessarily want to be there, and you get assigned a designer, and maybe you don't want to listen to the designer every day. But all of you have to work together to create something. Teaching is an extraordinarily useful preparation for having to do that. All right, I was a research assistant, library research, line editing, tact. In a moment of weakness, my dissertation director asked me to line edit a manuscript for her. In another moment of weakness, I said yes. There is a skill out there that is, how do you tell someone who is very senior to you that you think that that sentence is really terrible in a way that she can hear, right? And so one of the things I look for when I hire people is I think about who I report to, right? I think about who the big boss is. And when I hire people, I think to myself, can I expose her to the CEO? Can I put him in front of the shareholders? And so this is the kind of thing that I encourage you to think about yourself. And then finally here, this is the last one I'll talk about. I was treasurer of my graduate student union, something absolutely no one cared about until I came out to the non-academic job market, where all of a sudden they cared that I had managed a budget, right? That's a kind of a big deal. And this is why I encourage you to think about all the roles that you have had. Because people on the academic job market are not going to care that you were treasurer of your graduate student union. But somebody like me is going to care. Now, in my experience, the hard part of doing this is describing the skills you get from all the roles you did at the jobs you held in the same language, right? So that you can compare skills to each other. That's the hard part. This exercise is excruciating. It takes about 2 or 3 sessions, and it takes about 6 hours all told. But what you get out of it is you get a set of data about the things that you have learned and done. And then I ask you to do 2 things that are significantly easier, which is to sort what you've learned and then count it. So this was when you copy that blue column. I have put the sort here horizontally just for ease of display. You will need to do it in one column just because that's how Excel's tiny mind works. And after you do a sort, I ask you to do a count of all those skills. Look at that right-hand column. Here are the things I have done most in jobs I have had over the course of my career. Clear written explanations, clear oral explanations, empathy, customer service, data analysis, personnel development and management, and understanding organizational expectations. Every single one of you has done most of that. Not to the degree I have, because I'm more senior and I've taken on bigger stuff and I've been around longer. But all of you have done that. And the important thing about looking at skills in this way is to ask you to abstract the skills you have from the environment where you now use them. Because if what you say to an employer is, I know how to teach undergraduates, you may well not be hired. But if what you say to an employer is, I know how to explain difficult topics to people who are honestly not into it, you might get hired. Okay, so this is a lot of information, and it's a reasonably complex thing to ask you to do. So let me ask if you have questions about this. Yes, and let's make sure we get you a mic and that we turn on the mic. It's a little loud, watch out.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. First of all, are we going to have access to the template of this?
Absolutely. I will send you both the filled out exemplar and a template so you can see how to do it.
I don't know if the questions are appropriate for this moment, but I was wondering, do employers care when we did those things? If it was, for example, like 5 years, 10 years?
I'll talk about that when I talk about how to describe this stuff in a resume.
Yeah.
The unappealing answer to your question is usually, and what it comes down to is describing information that is relevant to the employer. Because if you can show that it's relevant when it happens is less a thing than that it contributed to what you can bring to that employer. But I'll show you some examples.
Okay, and it's a bit of a broad question, but you were saying your age and you were assuming we are young, but it's not my case. I mean, I'm 43 and I'll probably be done with my PhD when I'm 44.
Sure.
So do employers, like from your experience, of course, how much do employers care about this? Mm-hmm.
There's profound age discrimination in the marketplace, and it's much worse for women. The way I won't say get around it because there's no getting around it because it's such a profound societal thing, but the way you get through it is that you demonstrate what you have that is of value to an employer. And in my experience, people do all kinds of things to sort of not make their age obvious on a resume. You know, they leave off when they got their bachelor's degree, or they do other kinds of things.
Because I was reading your website and you said that they can figure out by the time.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, people are not stupid. And they can, you know, and sometimes what they'll do is they'll look at you and they will make assumptions that go the other way, particularly for women who say, she doesn't seem to be 25, she must be 50. It's like, what? What's wrong with you? Right? So I actually believe in putting real dates out there. I know there is information to the contrary, but honestly, I just think that does not work. And now that we all have the Google machine, right? If people are in any doubt, they can just go find out a totally disturbing amount of information about you.
But is there an age that you usually see people like having more difficulties, like 50s or?
50 is a marker. Gray hair is a marker. You know, my mother's been after me to dye my hair for years. Said it's easier for me to open my own business. She thought, oh, she's really crazy. But yeah, you know, 50 is a marker. 40 is often a marker for women. In technical fields, it can be even younger. But again, if you're having a conversation about age, you're having the wrong conversation. And so what I hope to give you guys is a way to talk about the things that you do best and bring to the workplace.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions about this exercise? Bring the mic down.
So I had noticed that when you were talking about the length of time it took to complete these activities, you were measuring them in like hours, and you were very specific about that. Is that something you do regularly, like to manage your time? You split things into hour bits, or is that just how you think about it?
So when it comes to managing my time, I try just to be conscious of it. What I'm reporting are the times that graduate students have reported to me. Because when I developed this spreadsheet, right, it iterated over time, because the first version was, you know, the first version. And it got better over time, and that took time. But what I would say to you about time management, and I'll have a book that is in the resources that talks a little bit about that can help with that stuff. But I think in general, the first thing to do is be conscious of how you're spending your time.
Thank you.
Any other questions about this? Okay. Now, let's go back to this. From current slide, okay. Now, once you have done that, what you have is a store of data about yourself. Now what you have to do is you have to create a resume from that data. I said to you earlier in this presentation that your message to a non-academic employer is, my skills can help solve your challenges. Your resume's message is, my skills can help solve your challenges, and here's proof. Your resume is proof of what you claim about yourself. So to do that, you highlight critical information in support of the claims you're making. You describe what you were responsible for and key skills you used, and you describe outcomes with measured results where that's possible. And I'll talk you through what to do when measured results are not possible. But now let's have a look at my resume. All right. Okay. First and most important pro tip about the resume. You must create a text file with all the data of your resume totally unformatted, because you are going to be cutting and pasting that information into online applications forever, right? Because a strongly formatted resume will not be suitable for submitting online. So make sure that you also have a blank text, an unformatted text file, and make sure you update it when you update your resume. So first things first, no funky monkey fonts, no Comic Sans. Since this stuff, you laugh, you would not believe what I have seen. Since this will be read online many times, I do recommend a sans serif font. And when you put your resume together, you should go to a bad copy machine and make 5 copies and make a PDF of that and see if that can be read online, because that is often how your resume is going to be read. You should have an email address. In most cases, that is not an academic one, unless applying from your academic department is an advantage. There are some programs that are well enough known and important enough that applying out of that department is an advantage. You should have the short URL to your LinkedIn profile, the telephone number that you actually respond to, and some indication of where you live. I do not recommend that any woman have her full snail mail address and her full street address on a resume, because honestly, there's creepy people out there, right? That's the basic information. There's a paragraph at the top that describes the things you are best at and the things that characterize you. For those of you in technical fields or in the bench sciences, sometimes at the bottom of this paragraph there is a bulleted list about computer languages you work in or lab techniques that you are well versed in. That is going to depend a little bit on your field. But then there's a summary. There used to be this very annoying paragraph that was that talked about the kind of work you were looking for. I'm glad that this paragraph is dying because all it ever said was, I'm looking for an interesting, challenging job in my field with interesting colleagues. And it was like, ugh, really? So I knew that. So that thing is going away. But then there's a paragraph, and then there is a work history, typically in reverse chronological order. I will talk about some ways that are different that you can organize it. But here is the one I want to talk about. So Lambda Legal, so this is a volunteer thing that I do. And you notice it is not labeled with the scarlet V for volunteer, because where you get your skills are skills. I don't care if they come from volunteering. But here are two sentences that I want you to be able to write for yourself. So first, as member of the board of directors, responsible for reviewing and approving policies, strategies, and budget of Lambda Legal, member of executive, strategic planning, and audit committees, member of search committee for new CEO, chair of technology subcommittee. As leader of Seattle leadership team, responsible for chairing Seattle Garden Party annual fundraiser netting in excess of $250,000. Now, those two sentences, the one I want you to be able to write is, here's what I was responsible for in this role. That's that top sentence. It says what they counted on you to do, right? Because an employer is thinking about hiring you to do a thing. So they need to know what things you have done before. And then the next sentence is results. As leader of Seattle leadership team. Don't be intimidated by the scope or the amount. That's just because I've had more practice and more time to get there. But I want you to be able to say, here's what I was responsible for, and in that role, here's what I did. Here are two sentences from an undergraduate resume of somebody to whom I offered a job. He said he had been his fraternity's social chairman in his senior year and its vice chairman in his junior year. And when he was a senior, he said, as social chair, organized in his senior year, organized 2 more events with 5% less budget. You've got to believe he was offered that job, right? Because he said, here's what I did, and here was the outcome. And most people would not necessarily have thought to talk about that kind of work. And that's why I'm encouraging you to look broadly at your experience, because your ability to make change, I think, is hidden in some ways from you. But I also want to go talk about a place that is actually closer to where you are now. This is how I describe my time as an assistant professor. I want to talk about the last sentence. Faculty supervisor of Graduate Student Journal turned it from dysfunctional mess into respected publication, efficiently produced. Now, some people look at that and say, ooh, can I say dysfunctional mess? And the answer is, it depends, right? It depends on your audience, right? And so you have to be conscious of your audience and whether you can say things like that to them. But I talk about this sentence in particular because it epitomizes the difference between what academics care about and what non-academics care about. This work I did, it was in women's studies, not only did not count for my tenure, I didn't get tenure, it not only didn't help me, it probably hurt me a little bit. But this was the sentence that got me the job interview at Amazon. Because this is what work is about. You take something that is less good and you make it better at the highest level. That is what work is. And I said, here is my proof case. I took something that was a mess and I made it better, and I could talk about how I had made it better and what I had done. And so part of what I want to do is give you confidence that some things that you may not value right now, actually can be pretty useful to you. So now, before taking questions, the only thing I would say is there used to be a line on the bottom like hobbies or what I do when I'm not working, right? And sometimes people put that on and sometimes they don't, but I would say it is no longer required. The other thing you absolutely no longer need is a line that says references available on request, because people assume that that's true. So you can save yourself a line. Okay, let's take questions. There's usually a lot of questions about resumes. All right.
In terms of the formatting of your descriptions, for part, you sort of did the bulk paragraph versus bullet points. So is there a strategy or which one is preferred, do you think?
Yeah, so let me take an example where I do both. So here's a good one of the internal audit. So what I tend to do is where it's what I'm responsible for, I tend to describe that in prose. And then achievements, I want to highlight a little bit, so I tend to bullet them. But there's different strategies that work for different people. I do not have religion about that. That just works for me. But in general, I try to do it so that complex thought processes have prose, because the sentences are usually a little more complex, and then achievements are much more bulleted. Yes?
I have a question about size. I know different countries and different places have different rules, but what's a general guideline about how long this should be?
I do not have religion about that, and I'll tell you why. So many resumes these days are submitted online that it's less relevant than it used to be. Here's what I do have religion about. You have to do what people ask you to do. So if they say, send in a one-page resume, send in a one-page resume. And you should never pad it to make it look longer than, or as long as you think it needs to be. But again, so much of this stuff is submitted online now, and you have to cut and paste to fill out online forms, that the length of the resume is not a huge problem. I do think there is no reason for anyone to have a job letter that is longer than 2 pages, or a page and change, you know? I think at that point you're going on too long. But I don't really worry about it with a resume. Yes?
I'm actually interested in the hobbies line you talked about. I'm wondering whether you look at that or whether you find that helpful in evaluating a resume. Like, is somebody saying they're an athlete or they do competitions and whatever for a hobby?
Right.
Is that
right.
important to you?
So if it is important enough to talk about, and athletics is actually a great example, if it's that important, it's probably going to go in your summary, right? Because what you're going to have is something like, you know, competitive athlete working on X, Y, and Z, you know. The thing I don't like about the hobbies line and the fact that it gets orphaned at the bottom of a resume like that is that it looks like a throwaway that people feel they have to have. And that's when I don't find it helpful. But if there are things about, you know, your hobbies that are definitive, then I would include them. So, and I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, a former student actually, used to do motorcycle touring around the United States on her vacations. And she was an attorney, and people advised her to leave that off her resume because they said, you know, men are going to be intimidated by, you know, bike touring. So then she interviewed to be in-house counsel at a manufacturing firm. And somebody said, well, you know, I don't know, are the men going to think you can handle a manufacturing floor? So when she put that resume together, she put the motorcycle touring not as a hobby, but in that paragraph of, you know, and I spend my leisure time, you know, it's important for me to explore the world, you know, on my own, and I do X, Y, and Z. And then they were reassured that she could absolutely handle a manufacturing floor. So it's really about your judgment. I just wouldn't orphan it at the bottom. Yes?
Are you going to talk later about who to use as references?
Yes.
Okay. I'll save my question.
Yeah, no, I'll have stuff about references. Okay, down here, there, and then in the middle again, right? Hold on, the people live streaming can't hear it. Okay.
Thank you. What's your opinion of a skill-based resume?
Yes. So rather than organizing your stuff in reverse chronology, you can have it by skills. So particularly for graduate students, they often have like a research resume, teaching, some people do subsets of lab techniques or data analysis. You can do that. The thing that you have to be careful of is that sometimes people get a little suspicious that a skills resume hides gaps. You know, because the thing about reverse chronology that is easy for lazy employers is they can look right down and say, oh yeah, you either have been continuously employed or you have explanations for time when you weren't, right? So, so a skills-based resume is fine, and there are fields, particularly I have found in computer science, where they are common. And so if you do that, just make sure that you can also show the chronology. So, yes.
Hi, sorry, maybe you said it, but maybe I missed it. So in resume, we don't include information about our publications and talks and all other things that we include in CV.
It depends on the job you're applying for. If you're applying for a job where, say, a research job where somebody is going to care about that, then yeah, you absolutely put them in. And they would go under the achievements, right, there. So, for example, when I did the first version of this resume, this is my educational one, I had, when I was first getting hired by this, I had a couple key publications under the University of Michigan. But again, it depends on the kind of work you're applying for. So if somebody's going to care about it, yeah, you absolutely put it there. But it is not, but the difference is it is not comprehensive. So in other words, everything, because most CVs, right, they have every publication you've ever done in reverse order, right? That's not what a resume is.
Thanks.
You bet.
Is it important to put your LinkedIn profile there?
In most fields, yes. I got a very funny question yesterday about someone. I'm trying to minimize my social profile. It's like, don't do it here. It a little bit depends on the field, right? So there will be, like, I find that doctors and lawyers, for example, particularly often do not have them. Lawyers more do now. But I think you have to have a presence on LinkedIn. It's the current tool. I mean, one day it will be something else. But people expect to find it. And in some fields, in any field that's technical, you have to be there. It's also geographically a little bit dependent. It's much more common both in the West of both Canada and the United States. But basically, I feel like you kind of have to be there. And if you do nothing else but just put your resume up, if you don't bother to use it for connections, though I will argue in a few minutes why you should, even if you just do that, your resume should be out there like that. Because the thing to know about LinkedIn is that when you sign up for it for the free version, you know, you get whatever it is you get. But HR and recruiting professionals sign up for a version that is much more powerful. The search engine is more powerful, and it gets them to people in a much more focused and quick way. And so they have tools that you will not. So I think it's required. Yep.
I have a couple questions that are sort of related. Does failure have a place in the resume? Like, is there any, I mean, obviously, if you look at assistant professor, it's a success, but also there's...
Right.
And then the other one sort of related is how you deal with any gaps that are present in someone's...
So with the failures, if it is, you know, here's why this project failed and here's what I learned from it. The way I generally handle that is I talk about the project and I speak to the failure, right? So the resume might list, you know, participated in X, Y, and Z, right? But whether the project failed or not is something I would speak to. And one reason for that actually is confidentiality, because you may be comfortable speaking about certain kinds of projects you were in that didn't go well, but your lab director may feel otherwise, right? So that's one question. Now, as to the gaps, it depends a little bit on how you talk about the gaps. The most common one of these in the United States and in Canada is maternity or paternity time off. And what you have to do is you have to talk about the time in ways that make sense to employers. So, for example, in my neighborhood, there's a woman who's just coming off maternity leave. She has 2 young children. But what she did is that she spent a bunch of time raising money for a playground to refurbish a local playground for her kids and for the neighborhood kids. And she has a really compelling story because it's not enough to say, took time off to raise kids, right? It is, sadly, I mean, it ought to be, but it's not. And so what you need to do is say to an employer, while I was raising children, I also ran, 3 projects that, raised $200,000 to redo this playground, right? Because employers think about things in terms of projects and budgets and schedules and colleagues and deliverables. And people who take time out of the workplace are doing stuff, right? But they're not usually talking about it in ways that it makes sense to employers. And so you have to think about that time so that when an employer looks at it, they can say, oh, right, there's all kinds of skills here. Behind you, next to you and then behind you. Go ahead.
I'm an international postdoc, so work permit related here at SFU. So if I want to find a new job here in BC, I need an employer who also sponsors my work permit. So do I put that on my resume, whether I have or don't have a work permit?
So the way you do it, so employers make the assumption that you're eligible for the job for which you apply. Right, so that's the baseline assumption. What I would do if I were applying, and they will make assumptions on the basis of that top information, right? So what I would do is, if it were me, for example, and I had something that was an advantage, I would say, eligible to work in the United States and the EU. Now, in your case, where this is going to come up is there are typically in the employment application that you fill out when you send in a CV and a letter, it will say, are you eligible to work in Canada currently? And then you will have to say, no, unless I get sponsored. And that is where I generally think it is advisable. Now, there's a couple other things you can do. One is that you can consult with your consulate about firms that have historically proved willing to take on folks or have a history of taking on folks from your home country. And the other thing you can do is make sure you're applying to firms that can afford to sponsor you, because there's at least some legal work, right? And at least some paperwork, less, I hope, than in the United States, but still some. And it is more likely that mid-size or larger firms can absorb that cost. So that's how I would handle it. Yes?
My question is just linked to what he asked. You were saying about talking about the gap, but do we mention gaps in the resume? Or they would just assume?
I wouldn't call them out as gaps. Mm-hmm. What I would do is explain what you were doing at various points in time.
But not during the interview?
No, I mean, I've seen them on resumes. And I'll show you my website because I have an article about exactly this, about how to handle those gaps.
Okay. And when you talk about gaps, do you mean any period that the person was not employed? For example, I was a visiting scholar because I got an award, but my visa didn't allow me to get any jobs. So I was just doing some volunteer things.
Right, but that's okay, but that's totally explainable, right? Because you were volunteering and you couldn't get a job, but there's, the time is accounted for, right? It doesn't mean that you have to be working every single second. It means that you have to be accounting for the time because employers are thinking, does this person want to work? Right? And so if they took 3 years off to backpack, that's awesome, but unless you can say what you learned from that and what you got from that, an employer may say, really? Okay. But that's what you have to explain, and that, like you weren't, in prison for opening a meth lab.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you. And my other question is, when they have the required and
desired,
and
right?
desired, somebody from here, because each country has a different culture, but somebody from here told me, but the person is not a specialist, like, for example, you don't have the PhD yet, but you're about to defend, or you don't have the exact skill, but you should apply anyway. So I really would like to know how does this
I'm going to talk about that.
Even if you don't have the requirement.
I'm going to talk about that in the next section.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
I guess it depends on where you apply, and I guess it's a very personal decision, but I'd like to ask what you think based on your experience. Disabilities, handicaps, and the like, is it better not to mention them whatsoever, or to actually mention them as a way to express differences, but also how you've overcome those challenges, or as a transparency kind of thing, because some of these things are going to show up anyway? Like, what's your opinion around those subjects?
So there's two separate questions there. There's whether you mention them at all, and then there's how they show up in the resume. So the resume part of the question is, to the degree that it is relevant to a challenge you solved, you can put it in. So if you have something, for example, like worked with a local school to create learning accommodations, not only for me, but for 2 other people who were affected by this disability. Here's what we started with, and here's where we got to, and it was a better outcome for this reason, right? So if you have that kind of experience, it can definitely go in the resume. Otherwise, what most people do is speak to this, right? And the one exception is if you had an extended absence from the paycheck workforce for a health-related issue, right? That's the one thing you might want to call out before you get in into an interview situation. But otherwise, speaking about how you overcame challenges, that's what work is, really, at some level. Okay, well, one more question, then we need to go on. Go ahead.
I was really interested in the anecdote you shared about your friend who was very accomplished on her maternity leave. Are employers expecting you to do more than keep a small human alive on your maternity leave? I hadn't considered that possibility.
No,
okay.
No. But here's the thing. Many employers are still male, right? They're still out there in the world, the gentlemen. And many employers do not understand that keeping a small human alive is a job. I personally hire mothers of young children because there is no one who knows better than a parent of a young child how to use a half hour. Mothers of young children do not waste a second. But what you have to do is you have to talk about those kinds of things in that way, because it is not often that employers will understand, like, kept a young human alive for 6 months, I'm totally astonished that I got there, thank God I can go back into the workforce, right? That's how many of them are going to think about that. So what I'm saying is that it's important to think about how an employer is going to perceive that information. Because the bias against parents of young children, mothers of young children, it actually works to men's favor. The bias against mothers of young children is profound. It's crazy doodle, but there you are. Okay. Now, there are going to be more questions related to resumes as we go on. So, you've changed how you describe yourself. You've got a way of getting new information about yourself. You're going to put it into the vehicle that we call a resume. Now you are going to need people to help you with your job search. This is something I spoke about earlier. Only a few people can help you get an academic job. Many people can help you get a non-academic job. And you have to assemble a pool of those people who can help you. Personal contacts help you find out what a job description really means. And I'll talk about who writes job descriptions, but we all know job advertisements, and we all know jobs that are utterly different from what was advertised. Personal contacts also help resumes not get lost in a pile. We've all heard those grisly stories about people who have sent out, 100 or 150 or 200 resumes and not gotten a single bite back. And I can explain why. But part of it is a lack of reaching out and understanding what the actual job is. So this is why you have to find people to help you. Now, LinkedIn is the current tool for that. It provides a database of companies, jobs, and people, and it deploys you into that pool. It helps you look for organizations and their listings. Here is its core function. It helps you ask for introduction to people you don't know through people you know. Everybody says to me, oh my gosh, Anne, I only have 30 LinkedIn contacts. And I have two answers for that. One is, you probably know more than 30 people, so we can help you, get a jet engine on that a little bit. But the other thing is how many people you know is not the point. The tool is about how many people they connect you to. It also makes your resume available online, which is important. What you have to do is you have to use LinkedIn to create a group of people you know through whom you reach out to others. That is its core function. So to do that, you have to create a pool of contacts. So you invite people you know on LinkedIn. That's people in your own address book and contacts. People LinkedIn recommends if you know it. Hey, Ann, do you know so-and-so? People from groups and societies to which you belong. You should all join the groups associated with your undergraduate and graduate institutions. Almost all of you have professional societies, right? North American Society of Mechanical Engineers, or whatever it is. You should join those groups. People with whom you have interacted well. My dentist is on LinkedIn. My dentist has a big practice. Now, you should not add people you don't know or whom you do not respect. How many of you have used LinkedIn at any level at all? Oh, way better than most groups, good. How many of you, those of you who have used LinkedIn, how many of you have gotten those requests to connect from people you have never, ever heard of? Yeah, that's creepy. Now, what I want you to ask yourself before you connect with somebody, bearing in mind that LinkedIn's function is to introduce you to people you don't know through people you do, ask yourself, would I introduce her to somebody I respect? Would I do him a favor? And if the answer is no or I don't know, then you probably shouldn't make that connection. Now, your mileage may vary about this. There are people who will accept a LinkedIn connection request from anyone who labels him or herself as a recruiter. I understand this behavior, but anybody can call him or herself a recruiter. I think unless you know them, it is unwise. Your mileage may vary, as they say on the internet. Now, your contacts, whether in LinkedIn or elsewhere, are one of your core professional assets, and you must treat them this way. Keep your contacts updated. Bring them up to date. I'm talking about your professional contacts, right? Not a holiday card list, not your family Facebook group, but professional stuff. You need a name, a private and/or a work email address, and a mobile phone number. LinkedIn contacts are fine and totally enough for purely professional connections, right? People you meet at conferences and had a good interaction with. You should set a calendar reminder to invite new LinkedIn connections every week, right? Every Friday at 3 or whatever it is, look it over and try to think of who you should invite. You must back them up, right? Anything not on LinkedIn, which you can rely on them to back up. You need to use the rule of 3 for backups. A local backup, a cloud backup, and an external device. but your contacts are a core professional asset and you must treat them that way. Okay, now I'm going to move into the part of the presentation that is about how to prepare yourself mentally while you're still in graduate school. And the first part of this gets to a question that someone just asked. This is a note about gender. This is what guys do in the job market. If a job asks for 6 qualifications and he has 3, a guy will apply. A guy views job requirements as optional and desired ones as entirely optional. And a guy routinely negotiates salary and benefits. Here's what women do. A woman does not apply if a job asks for 6 qualifications and she has 5. A woman views job requirements as non-negotiable and desired ones as basically practically required. And a woman routinely does not negotiate her salary and benefits. Gentlemen, keep doing what you're doing. Ladies, do not be this applicant. You are cutting yourself off from jobs that you can do. You are self-censoring yourself out of the workplace. Apply for the job. And I'm not saying apply for something that you are totally not capable of doing or have no experience at all. But I am saying if you can make a credible case that your skill set can help that employer in that job, apply for the job. And this is something that most women will struggle against their entire careers. Now, a note about starting over. You may find yourself applying for some entry-level jobs. In my experience, people with PhDs get promoted faster out of entry-level jobs because they're a little bit older, they've had some experience, and they've interacted with people more. It is also the case that many non-entry-level jobs will be open to you if you describe your skills well. This is a particular problem for people who, like me, are the children of immigrants. You will find people saying, oh my God, you went and you got X degree and this is your job, right? And that is worse in my experience for immigrant kids. And it's just important to realize that because the argument you make about it is, yeah, but look at this history I have. I will, in my experience, people get promoted out of entry-level jobs, people who have graduate training. Now, you can also start with an interim job. Find almost any job. Work at Canadian Tire, right? Work at Tim Hortons, work at Home Depot. This is really hard for immigrant kids. But the reason I say it is that while you are looking for a job, if you are not still in graduate school or not actively working at your graduate institution, having a job helps you present yourself well, right? And having a little money come in makes you sit up straighter. The other thing is that after the bias against pregnant women and against older workers, the most profound workplace bias out there is that employers prefer to hire people who are employed. It's crazy, but that's the way it is. It is also easy to explain why you are working at an interim job. Some people say to me, oh my God, what will I say if I'm working at Tim Hortons and I just defended my PhD in microbiology. And the question is how you talk about it. So if you say, yeah, this isn't my forever job, I'm looking for an industry job, but I wanted to find out about another workplace and another boss, and I wanted to bring some money in, right? No one doesn't understand that. But if what you say is, yeah, that's the only place that would hire me. It's like, yeah, I'm going to join the ranks of people who would not hire you, right? If that's how you talk about it. But seriously, employers want to hire people who want to work. And a signal that people want to work is that they are working, especially at a job that may seem menial to other people. So, also, this is one piece of advice that I think more people should take, which is that you can start with a temp or a contract job. What you do in this is you basically outsource the last mile of your job search. So you go in and you talk to a temp or contract agency, and they match you up with jobs that may be suited to you. Now, there are some advantages to this, right? One thing is that, you know, again, you learn about a company, an industry, and a boss, but you can do contract work successfully long-term. And if you have a spouse or a partner who changes jobs a lot, right? A lot of spouses of military people do contract work, right? Because they're frequently moving. But the other thing is that a lot of contract firms have offices throughout Canada. And so when you need to move, if you've done well for a contract firm in one location, they will sometimes help you transfer to another. Now, the next 3 slides talk about some misconceptions that people sometimes have about job sectors. So in the for-profit sector, sometimes people believe that once you leave academics and once you leave research, you'll have less intelligent colleagues or less intellectually demanding work. I am here to tell you that Amazon is the most demanding place intellectually that I have ever worked in my life. And it is, in my experience, not true that when you leave academics, intellectual standards drop. Now, if you believe this, however, you must conceal it. Because no employer wants to be your intellectual sloppy seconds, right? Nobody wants to believe that you're here because you just, you know, you're compromising, right? Do not treat your new colleagues that way. Now, in the nonprofit world, many people believe, and I have no idea why, this is so weird to me, many people believe that it is easier to get a nonprofit job without the relevant experience than a for-profit job. In my experience, it's actually the reverse. So I've worked for a long time with Lambda Legal Defense and Education Network, and we litigate on behalf of LGBTQ people and people who are HIV positive. And these are high-profile, scary cases. And we can't afford, generally, to hire new lawyers. We have to hire people who are experienced, just because of the stakes. And you will find a lot of nonprofit organizations like this. Some can hire entry-level people, but some cannot. But the main thing you shouldn't do is make the assumption that you have an easier in there because it's nonprofit. Some people also believe that people in the nonprofit sector are better motivated than people in for-profit or public sector jobs. Honestly, I just haven't found that to be true. And related to that, people believe that, you know, you might get paid less in the nonprofit sector, but it will be compensated for because your work will be more rewarding. And that depends not on the job, that depends on you. That depends on how you look at intrinsic rewards. But I'm here to tell you that the person doing accounts payable at Amazon and the person doing accounts payable at Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund are kind of doing the same job. And whether they find it more or less valuable or not is totally on them, but it's not a function of the job. Now, the public sector. This is different from private and nonprofit sector. It is the case that hiring requirements may be more rigid. I have talked here about how to describe yourself well, but a lot of these jobs are defined by statute, and so if they require a master's degree and you don't have one, sometimes that's hard to break through. It is very often the case that you can't negotiate compensation and benefits. Here's one thing, your salary may be publicly available. When I was an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and I was therefore an employee of the state of Michigan, and my salary was published every year along with every other member of this employee of the state, I kind of felt for a year like I was not wearing underwear. You know, I hated having that private information out in public, but I came to like it over time, and here's why. Publicly available data benefits people with less power. And when it comes to salary, that's women. And so I actually grew to be a fan of publicly available salary data because it helps people point out when the playing field isn't level. Your comments about your job on social media are much more likely to be subject to regulation if you are a public employee, particularly if you are a public employee in law enforcement. And this is not all your comments on social media, but ones about your job. Here is a personal pitch. I would like everyone in this room to consider running for office one day or helping another candidate run for office. In my experience, not enough people with graduate training consider running for office, particularly in scientific fields. And the way to find out if you want to do that is to shadow a campaign or to volunteer. But I hope all of you will think about politics as something that is important to be involved in as a citizen of whatever country you are end up living in. Now, some comments about handling the slog of a job search, because it's a slog. You are in this room because you have succeeded on the academic path. You did well in secondary school, you got into university, you did well at university, you got into a graduate program. The path to a non-academic job is going to have a lot of disappointments, right? Stuff that gets filled just before you apply, right? Few resumes acknowledged, right? Not very many phone screens, not very many interviews, and not very many job offers. This is going to happen. This is normal. It is not a sign that you are failing. I recommend that all of you read this wonderful essay by Devoni Lucer, Me and My Shadow CV. And it actually addresses that question of failure that you asked about, because it talks about what would my CV look like if it listed all the failures, right? And it's a healthy reminder that, you know, people who have shining CVs, you know, they're not telling you the whole story, as, you know, why should they? But it's really, really important to remember this when you handle the slog, because job searches are a slog. All right, before I go into the actual mechanics of a job search, I want to ask if you have any questions about that mental preparation.
I am a political science major student and I am looking for jobs in non-profit sector. But as I have always been a student, I haven't worked full-time ever. I have always studied, so I don't have like proper paid jobs. I have jobs that I did as a TA and all, and I have volunteering experience. Someone suggested that in my resume I write it like paid jobs and non-paid jobs. Is that wise?
That you sort them that way?
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't. I mean, here's what I would do. I would draft 2 resumes, one where you sort them and one where you don't. And ask somebody in the nonprofit world to look at both resumes and tell you which one is more persuasive. Because for me, and this is how I think about people whom I hire, I don't care where they got their skills or their experience. All I care is that they have it and that they have the skills. But it's not bad advice. It's just not the advice I would give. So draft it both ways and have somebody outside academics look at it for you. Yes?
Just to follow up on LinkedIn, so you've talked about tailoring your content, obviously, on your resume, but LinkedIn is, trying to remember off the top of my head, like what the format is. So right now, mine's geared a bit more towards academic stuff. It's like, this is all my presentations, because that's mostly what I've been doing in publications. And what going into work, I'll probably be highlighting some of the volunteer chairing a board of a nonprofit over the past year because I have a small child, and that's kind of what I've been doing. But on LinkedIn, obviously, you can't tailor it. So I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions about should you be tailoring the content, and if you're keeping your doors open and you're not sure if you're going to be doing like research work or you're open to anything. Like
so the important thing to do is that top paragraph at LinkedIn is the one where you define the kinds of things you are currently looking for. The thing is, because beneath LinkedIn you can have as much stuff as you want, right? What you then have to do is you have to change the order of it, right? So it has the listings of the things you want to do next, and then, you know, your publications might drop to the bottom and your volunteer experience might rise. But the main thing about LinkedIn is because everybody knows its limitations, and almost everyone does not have like this one thin, straight career path. they'll be aware of that. Yeah. So. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the mechanics of a non-academic job search. So I'm going to talk about job postings, first of all, and how to read them, about hiring managers, how people like me think about people like you, and then job search logistics. So, first, how to start searching online. This is how people typically search for job postings. They'll constrain it geographically, right? Within a commute distance or within public transportation or whatever. They will search by field or job type. Some people search by network, which you can do if you've been assiduous in gathering LinkedIn connections. This is what some people do who have been in academics, particularly people with PhDs. There are so few jobs in academics for PhDs, but the good news is the path to them is entirely straightforward. People know exactly how to apply. So they apply for them all, right? Because you do. But if they don't get one of those jobs, or they think they might want to look for non-academic stuff, they try the same thing for non-academic jobs, which is they apply for everything. This will make you crazy. Do not do this. This throwing spaghetti at a wall and see what sticks is not only not helpful and not working, but it'll make you nuts, and it's a waste of your time. This is how most online job searches begin, most successful ones. This is not how they end by any means. But what most people do is they take a set of keywords describing what they do best and they constrain it somehow, right, to British Columbia or to Montreal and Toronto or whatever it is. But they do some kind of sensible geographic constraint that makes you have not 4,000 opportunities, but 200, something like that. But that's how to start searching online for jobs. Now, you do not necessarily have to look for a job. You can look for the organization instead of a job, right? So look for websites of companies and nonprofits and public sector things that you admire, or as I've said, that you want to improve. But try to hire yourself a company rather than find yourself a job. That's a totally legitimate approach. You can also look in publications on and offline of places you would like to live, which is to search for the place rather than the job. Now, this is a very hard thing, especially for people with PhDs, because they are so used to having to go exactly where the tiny number of opportunities are, that they never really consider, I don't have to do that anymore, right? I could find myself a place to live that I like and then look for work, assuming it has at least some opportunities. Here's something else to think about. Educated, relatively young people are a very, very desirable group of people for city planners and town planners and county planners. People want you to move to their places. So look online for places you would like to live, and you know, all of these, whether it's a chamber of commerce or whatever it is, they will typically list their top employers. And if they don't, call them and ask them, right? It is perfectly possible to hire yourself a place to live. Now, international students. So pro tip here. Find the companies from your home country that do business in Canada, and find the top Canadian companies that do business in your home country, because they're the ones with the strongest vested interest in your dual training. Now, your consulate or your embassy can help you, but get in the habit of talking to them and, you know, getting their understanding of their job listings. It is very much worthwhile asking who from your home country has recently gotten a job in or around your field, because you are going to want to learn from them. Now, here's a really underappreciated thing about job postings, which is who writes them. Sometimes the hiring manager, right, the person you're actually going to work for, writes them. But sometimes somebody in human resource writes them. This is particularly the case at larger institutions where they hire a bunch of the same level of people every year, right? They hire a bunch of new people to work in labs. They hire a bunch of new people to do field work for them. There's very often a generic job description. Sometimes the job description is written by the last person to hold the job, particularly if they succeeded. I wrote my first 3 job descriptions at Amazon for the next person to hold them just because the jobs had never existed before, right? So that means, of course, that the job description was profoundly biased for my thinking. Here's the thing you have to realize. The person you will be directly working for has not always written the job description. And that means, this is why I talk about LinkedIn as much as I do, because a personal contact at the organization is going to be your best source about, I know what the job description says, but what does it really mean, right? Here's another underappreciated thing. Who are these job descriptions for? Directly, of course, they're for people like you, people who are applying for the jobs, and also people who may want to transfer within the organization, so internal and external candidates. But indirectly, they are also written for the hiring manager's boss and for finance. You see a lot of this after recessions. After recessions, when people haven't been able to hire for a long time, and then they finally get permission to make one hire, and they throw absolutely everything into the job description. And they say, oh, yeah, I know I need a Python developer, but gosh, could they also handle facilities and tune our databases? And it's like, what? Why would you even think someone could do all that stuff? And so when you see job descriptions like that, that's often where it comes from, because the job description is written with many audiences in mind. Again, you guys are not the only audience for the job description, and it's really important to work on getting a personal contact or somebody at the organization who can describe to you what the job description really means. You know, so they say, oh yeah, that guy, he always wants somebody to tune his databases and he hates facilities work, but what he really needs is a Python developer, right? Now, how do you learn to read them? The good news is you learn it exactly the way you learn anything else, and you guys, since you're here, you're already good at learning. You have to read a lot of them. Read at least 100 before you apply to anything. The hyperlinks in here are to links on my website where I talk about how to read job descriptions in detail. You need to learn the academic nearest equivalents for required and desired skills. So when they say, for example, communication, they don't mean, can you put coherent sentences in front of another? Actually, what they mean there is, can you talk to the boss and not embarrass me? Or they say, this is a shareholder relations job, so you need to, not blather in public. You need to be conscious of what the financial regulations are, or whatever it is. But what they say and what they mean are not the same things, and you need to crack that code before you apply. This is the single best way to learn how to read job descriptions. Ask friends who are in that kind of work to help you interpret what they are. Sometimes the folks in the Career Center will be good at this. If you get a job description, you go in and you say, this sounds good, but what does this mean, right? You can get help that way. But the single best way to learn how to read a job description is to get somebody at that firm or in that line of work to tell you what that currently means. Now, here's a point about informational interviews. If you've seen a job description that sounds good, but you don't really know whether you could do it, or if you have found yourself a company that sounds good, but they don't have an opening for you currently, here is something you can do. You can ask for something called an informational interview. And that means contacting either their recruiting or their HR function and asking and saying, for example, I notice you don't have any openings that are currently suited to my skill set. Do you have a regular schedule of informational interviews where I can come and find out about your company or find out about this job family? And when you're doing a job search, you should try to do those as frequently as you can manage. I would try to do at least one of those a month to sort of figure out, what is this company about, right? Because over time, you will meet people and you will gradually learn the language of where you're applying and the jobs you're applying for. And informational interviews are a great, inexpensive way to get that education. You will have more luck with informational interviews across a variety of jobs at medium and larger companies, because this is something they often do. You may have more luck actually getting a first one at a smaller organization if they are, flattered by the attention. But in my experience, smaller organizations very often don't have the staff to do a lot of this, right? So don't be disappointed. But informational interviews are important. Okay, there are no perfect candidates. This gets back to your question about when to apply if you don't have all the required and desired qualifications. There are no perfect candidates. All applicants have different skills in different degrees. If you like the job description, but you do not have every required and desired qualification, find out which of them are key. And if you like the job description and you can make a credible case that you can help solve that employer's challenges, apply for the job. In this regard, job searches are a lot like dating on both sides. And the example I always use is my 16-year-old nephew, my 16-year-old cousin who came here from Sweden to stay with us for 3 weeks, 2 summers ago. And he wanted what every other 16-year-old straight boy wants, which is a girlfriend. So I asked him what he wanted, and he had a list of 23 things. I mean, I've worked with smaller databases, and I said, so Gustav, whatever. And so he went back to Sweden. And then he met a real live human girl. And it turned out she didn't have all those 23 attributes, but she had 3 key attributes, which were she was nice, she was fun, and most of all, she was willing to date my cousin. And job hunts are exactly like this on both sides of the job hunt, right? Because you want everything, but you know what you really need, and very quickly you start optimizing for that, right? Because as an employer, and I start looking for resumes, it's like, man, this person will be great, but I've really got to have this thing, and this thing is not here, right? So you start filtering, right? And even though you have a wish list of, think of a child who wants absolutely everything for a holiday present, there's probably a thing they want most, right? Employers are exactly like this. So it's really important that you realize there are no perfect candidates who have absolutely everything at all times. If you can make the case, apply for the job. Ladies, if you like the job description and you can make a case for yourself, apply for the job. Women self-censor their way out of many, many opportunities, and I urge you, don't let perfection get in the way, or perceived perfection get in the way of a job that you could have and do well. Now, so before I go into hiring managers, let me ask if you have any questions about job descriptions or how to read them. Yes?
So I've been finding jobs through LinkedIn, and then they'll usually have the job description there, and then it'll link to the actual website. But often they'll be they'll be similar but not identical. So why, first of all, would there be two different things? And then how do you sort of disseminate that?
Yeah. Sadly, I can tell you exactly why. So what happens is that somebody has a job and they say, okay, I'm going to put it out there on LinkedIn. And maybe they put it out, but then it's HR or internal systems that are responsible for putting the official post up on the internal website, right? So they put it out there. So there are two things you have to do. One is you have to look at the differences in the job description, because typically it's the actual hiring manager who has put out the job description out on social media or wherever it is, and they may very well have tweaked it for what they actually want. So look at the two side by side and say, okay, what's the difference here? You know, one may say, no, 3 to 5 years, absolutely required. And the other may say, 3 to 5 years is desirable, but basically if you've been doing this for 6 months and you're willing to move here, I'll hire you, right? The differences usually aren't that stark, but they're often very telling. So that's where it comes from. And what I would do is write your application. If the difference is that big, I would call HR or recruiting. I would say, hey, you know, I'm really interested in this job, but what I saw online and where it linked to seemed like way different. What's going on? And it may be as simple as the link is broken. It doesn't go to the job description it should. But what you might get is some information about, oh, definitely apply for what you see online, right? So I would call and ask. I, in general, would bias my application toward the thing I saw specifically and most recently out on social media, because the thing on the company website is a little more likely to be generic and a little more likely to have been posted by somebody other than the hiring manager. Down there.
Thank you. What about things that you can do while you're still a graduate student or postdoc that are useful for establishing connections, foot in the doors within organizations, like co-op or My Tax internships?
So I'm a fan of internships. I'm a fan of both internships and job shadowing. And I think any experience you get is really good. The most important things you can do, in addition to those, are build up your LinkedIn contacts and do research. In my experience, a job search for your first non-academic job takes about 6 months. Of that, I expect people will spend a minimum of 3 to 4 months purely in the research stage, right? Which is reading a ton of job descriptions, doing research on companies. Because the thing about job searching is that it's a two-way street. Not only do you want a good job, but they want a good employee, right? Not every place is an equally good fit. So what you can do ahead of the search is do research. And totally co-op helps, because you learn about an actual employee, an actual place of employment. Anyone else? Okay. Now, this is about hiring managers, about the people who are actually making the decision to hire you. Here's what they need. They need someone to solve problems for them, either handle the volume of work or take on a new type of work. This is why that core message that I highlighted in red at the beginning is, my skills can help solve your challenges. Now, sometimes hiring managers don't know everything they need, especially for a new type of work, because in big organizations, people get reorganized all the time. One day at Amazon, I found myself managing the photo studio, about which I knew exactly nothing. And I had to get up to speed on it very, very quickly. And so when hiring decisions were made, I had to rely on people to educate me fast. And it meant that when I talked to candidates, if I could say, well, you know, here's what I think I need, and they said, whoa, have you thought about the following 37 things that would also really help you, right? When you sense that there is room for definition around the job description, that's where you can come in and say, here's what I can do. Now, the reason I have gone to so much trouble to stress who writes job descriptions is that sometimes what a hiring manager needs is not in the job description, especially if somebody else wrote it. And this is where, if you can think on your feet and do this in the interview and find out about it and do research, this is where you can say, oh, you know, I know they're stressing this whole facilities thing, but what they really need is the Python developer. Now, here's what hiring managers want. And this goes back to my comment about dating. Hiring managers want every skill they need, but believe me when I say they will take a subset. And they will take a subset if the skill they need is in high demand, if the job is in a location that is hard to recruit for, if the job's been open for a while and it's important. Above all, if the candidate is smart and willing to learn. One of the things that I think more graduate student resumes should talk about is how quickly you guys have to learn new stuff. You know, one of the things I'm always impressed about with graduate students is, you know, they get plunked into a new lab or a new project or a new supervisor, and they have to get up to speed fast. And I gotta tell you, it is very, very rare that people hold on to jobs for a whole career anymore. Jobs are changing very fast, and people need to be smart and willing to learn. I have to hire not for what I see right in front of me at that very moment, but for what I think that person can become in 6 and 12 and 18 and 24 months. Because what I need them to do is going to change. One of my secret Jedi skills is talking to nervous parents. And when I talk to parents, particularly of undergraduates who say, oh my God, will my daughter ever get a job, and can she get a job that she can keep forever? Which is a natural parent thing to want. I do this exercise with them. I say, okay, nervous parents, sometimes I actually say that, think back to when you left formal education. And remember that job, that first job you had at formal education. Put your hand in the air if you still have that job. I have never yet had a hand go up, never, in all the years I have been doing this kind of consulting. And that's because people change jobs all the time. And they grow and they learn things. And your ability to do that is one of the most important skills you have. And you all have evidence of that in your current work. Now, here's a really important difference from your graduate work. An employer is going to want people to start work either as soon as possible or as soon as budgeted. They say you can't start till July 1st because I don't have a budget, that's when the job starts. But what that means for you guys is it is very important to know when your degree work will be done. Because it's going to take a while to do a job search and it's going to take a while to get a job. So if they say, you know, they're going to assume that a notice period for a junior person is going to be 2 weeks, and for a senior person it's going to be 4 weeks. So you won't be able to say, probably, can I start in September after I defend my dissertation at the end of the summer, right? So it's really important to know when you're going to finish and to sort of work back from that as you look for a job. Because a hiring manager, once they identify you and they realize you're great, they're going to want you to start work. Here's how hiring managers behave. They have an idea of the person and skills they want, just like my cousin Gustav knew who he thought he wanted to date, but they can be persuaded otherwise. You can make the case that you are the right person with the right skills. Here's why I focus on LinkedIn so much. Hiring managers trust somebody who has worked at their company or knows it well or knows the hiring manager well more than they trust anybody else to recommend candidates. This is why finding a connection at the actual organization is so valuable. Okay. Any questions? Before I go in to talk about the logistics of a job search, any questions about hiring managers? Talking to the actual human beings. Yes.
Is it common that being a hiring manager is a full-time position, or are these people also in other roles? And then it's like, who are
hiring
managers?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So it is, if they are a full-time hiring manager, they're actually not called a hiring manager. They're just called recruiters. By hiring manager, I mean the person who's running the organization and doing the work that you're actually being hired for. So a actually, this is a great point. A hiring manager is doing a ton of other things. They're managing a bunch of people, they're managing a bunch of projects, they're very, very busy. And so one of the really common frustrations I hear from graduate students is, oh my God, the hiring manager said he'd get back to me and I haven't heard in 3 days. It's like, yeah, they're busy, you know? And so that's when it gets to be on you to follow up. But a hiring manager who's full-time is called a recruiter. Yeah, and honestly, the organization has to be pretty big for them to invest full-time in recruiters. You know, almost everybody has another job. So, any other questions? Okay, here's about the actual logistics of how you conduct a job search. First, this is what you must do before you apply to any academic job. Not before you do research, but before you apply. You have to draft a resume, not a CV, and somebody in a non-academic workplace, a friend or whatever, has to critique it. I would avoid having a blood relative do this, just between you and me, but your mileage may vary. Get it, revise it, get it reviewed again, and then put it up on LinkedIn. Read lots of job descriptions. Learn the jargon so you're comfortable with it. This is just like learning MATLAB or ancient Greek. You just have to go through it and do it. It's important that you review your online presence and be able to explain what's there. Do not engage in the folly of trying to erase the internet. This is not going to happen. But make sure you check blogs and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest. Do a vanity Google search and go back about 3 pages of results, right? Just make sure you can explain what other people find. One thing is that if you have a common name, in fact, it will be important for you to identify which online is you and which is not you. There's an Anne Krook who designs furniture in Sweden. I had no idea, but I am not she. Okay, a writing sample. It is advisable, sometimes by writing sample it means work sample or code sample. It is advisable to revise or create a short writing sample for intelligent, interested, non-specialist readers. One of the first filters I apply, this is particularly important for people with PhDs. One of the first filters I apply is, can they speak to people who don't know anything about their subject? Because by the time you get up there and you do your own research, you are going to be the person who knows more than anything else about it. But you must be able to talk to people who know less to work in most workplaces, right? And the way I judge that is typically through a writing sample. And again, sometimes it's a code sample, sometimes it's a design portfolio. Sometimes graduate students ask me, can I send a chapter of my dissertation? The answer is no. The answer can be hell no. But no, you must imagine an audience of interested non-specialists. Also, once you're at the tail end of your graduate work, you and I mean something very different by brief. I mean 2 typewritten pages, right? Typically 500 words. I mean, under the old model, a word processed page was 250 words. Now just look at the word count in Word. But briefer is better. These can be anything, right? These can be a course description you wrote for something you taught. It can be an abstract of a conference paper if it is for non-specialists. It can be a memo you wrote to your affinity organization. It can be all kinds of things, but I need to know, can you communicate clearly and well? You should identify and clean your interview clothing. You will get interviews sometimes on very short notice, and so you need to have something to wear. International students, you must know and have documents for your visa status. You have to be absolutely buttoned up about this. Okay, so that's what I assume you have done before anything starts. Now, here's the actual process of getting a job. You find a job listing, you research the organization, you find a contact there if you can and discuss the job. You apply with a resume and a letter. There's typically, these days, a phone or a video interview. Then, if you advance, there's an in-person interview. You most often will have to submit references. And then you receive an offer, and you negotiate its terms. Now, the nightmare stories you hear of people who apply for 200 things and get no bites back have not done the stuff in blue. You've got to, before you apply, you've got to research the organization and try to find a contact there, because you need to find out if there's really a good fit for you, because otherwise you will be sending out a lot of generic letters and people can tell. So that's the basic process. Now, your very first contact with an organization after the research, you're going to write a job letter that is tailored to the job. So there will be a unique job letter for every job. Now, there will be a lot of repetition, of course, but the job letter to that is one-on-one. An absolute kiss of death is getting a letter that is clearly and obviously written for some other job. You need to submit a resume that is suited to the job. Most people have about 3 resumes, right? They might have, here's the research resume, and here's the teaching position resume, and here's the public service resume, or however it is you end up organizing it. But most people have about 3 resumes. When I went on the academic job market, and I did 17th and 18th century British literature, I had the long 18th century, I had the Milton resume, and I had the 17th century resume. It's very important when you keep track of your information to know which you sent to which employer. Your LinkedIn, and this is what we talked about for LinkedIn, your LinkedIn profile has to support and be credible for what you're applying for. Now, most people will read either the resume or the job letter carefully, but they will not read both equally carefully. So what this means is that your resume and your job letter have to make sense by themselves for the job. And that doesn't mean, you attach your resume, you attach the letter at the bottom of your resume, but it means that a hiring manager who is looking at either your job letter or your resume has to be able to say, oh yeah, I could see hiring that person, but independently. Now, when somebody like me interviews somebody like you or gets ready to interview you, here's what I do. I look at your LinkedIn profile and I see if we know anybody in common. I Google your name. I read your job letter and your resume not equally carefully, right? Many, many people out there will read only one. I always at least glance at both, but in general, I spend more time on the resume. I will always ask around, whether on social media or on LinkedIn or at a job site, I will always ask around and say, anybody heard of this person? Didn't we hire somebody from SFU like 3 years ago? Do you know this person? And then I will review your writing or your work or your code sample, if any. That's what I do to get ready. Make sure you know what I find when I go to do this, because you have to come into the interview knowing at least as much about how I see you as you do. That's the important thing. Now, for all interviews, whether phone or video or in person, you have to prepare at least 3 questions for who's ever interviewing you. One about the job, one about the location, and one about the organization. If you don't put the time in to be that interested in the organization, there is no reason for me to put time in to be interested in you. For phone and video interviews, which are increasingly common, you might be asked to use a platform you haven't used before. If that's the case, make sure you download and test it first. Also, try to make sure your phone area is free of visual distractions. So if you have young children, you know, if like me, you have a noisy, nosy Jack Russell, if you live in a shared space, you might want to ask somebody at Career Services here at SFU or a friend to borrow a quiet place. Don't ever do a phone or video interview from an internet cafe because many organizations will not want their private discussions being heard in public. So, sad pro tip. Do not stop your job search if you get an interview. Do not stop your job search until you are seated in your job at your new desk. One of the things about academics, where there are very few academic jobs, is getting an interview is such a big deal that it tends to cause like location blindness, right? And so when people go in the non-academic job market, they get an interview and they go, I got an interview, and they grab it. And they stop thinking about other things. Don't do that. That will really slow down your job search. It's very, very important to keep following multiple avenues until you are seated in your desk. And then once you are seated in your desk, remember, you should be adding 2 new people on LinkedIn a week, every week, forever. And your resume should always be up to date, because you just never know, right? Projects get canceled and stuff happens, so make sure you are always ready for the job market. Now, for in-person interviews, when somebody calls you to schedule an interview, you may absolutely ask about the standard of dress, right? How do people, and you can say right out loud, how do people normally dress for interviews? And they'll often say business casual, or, you know, dress like you would in the lab, or, you know, we'll provide a hood so you can, you know, demonstrate your control of this technique, or whatever it is. But if you forget, you can't call and ask. So ask, and if you forget and you realize you haven't, just go in, you know, business casual. If you are given the name of your interviewers, do what they're going to do to you. Look them up on LinkedIn and Google. So, pro tip. Even if you normally take notes on a device, which I now do 99% of the time, in interviewing, I recommend a pad and pen, and here's why. When I take notes on a device, here's where my eyes are. When I take notes with a pad and pen, here's where my eyes are. That little difference will help you keep looking at the person who is interviewing you. So think about, there are many people who almost can't read their own handwriting anymore. I sadly fall into that category, but I really do recommend taking notes on paper. You should bring a hard copy with your references, name, and contact information. That should not be on your resume, that information, and you should wait to be asked to hand it over. But if you have had a good interview, and if they say, wow, this has been great, you know, we're gonna talk to your references, you know, you wanna be able to say, okay, here they are, right? And finally, if you are not told when you can expect to hear back about the results of the interview, you may ask. It will typically be about a week later. And then if they miss the deadline, or as I should sometimes say, when they miss the deadline, if they say, oh, we'll let you know by next Monday, and you haven't heard by Wednesday, then you can email. And if you haven't heard by that Friday, then you can call. Now, after the interview, send a thank you note to the hiring manager. Email is totally fine. If you have better handwriting than mine, a handwritten note is better. I will say this about handwritten notes. I spend a lot of time every year raising money for Lambda Legal. And after Lambda Legal's lawyers' good work, The single most powerful fundraising tool I have is a handwritten thank you note. And I'm now chair of the board of directors, so I write to every member of the board who donates, I write to every staff member who donates, and to some higher dollar donors. So I write, I don't know, 8 to 10 thank you notes a week. It's an extraordinary powerful tool, partly because snail mail is, such a rare thing these days. It's a worthwhile skill to develop. And if you have had good interactions with the people who have interviewed you, you may invite them to connect on LinkedIn, right? It's just like at conferences, right? If you've had good interactions, you can invite them to connect on LinkedIn. This is how, over time, you will build up a network of professional connections. Now, references. This is one of the biggest areas of difference between non-academic and academic job searches. These are usually given by phone or submitted online. For academic jobs or for postdocs or for whatever, typically your referees are going to write them up and deposit them somewhere ahead of time, and they'll just be sent out as required. But these are going to be typically given out each time. Now, requested response time is much shorter than for the reference for an academic job. So if you have a supervisor who is going to be in the field and out of pocket for, between semesters or something, you need to find that out. Just because if they're asked to give a reference, it's going to be quicker. You'll need usually between 3 and 5. They can be your current research colleagues. One does not have to be your thesis supervisor or your PI. One of the things I like about the non-academic job world is that, unlike academics, where not having a good letter from your supervisor is basically fatal, that is not true in the non-academic job world. References tend to be confirmatory, and everybody knows about not getting along with the boss. So you will need strong letters of reference, and you will need it from people who know your work, but not having a letter from your supervisor is not fatal. Because there are still, I'm sorry to say, many people who believe they cannot tell their supervisors that they're looking for non-academic jobs. Sad but true. It is helpful but not required if one of those referees can speak to your work in non-academic settings. And for all your referees, make sure you give them both the job description and your current resume so they get a sense of what they're talking about. And again, references are less critical for non-academic jobs than for academic-based ones, right? The other thing to realize about this is another psychological dynamic that's different, is that if you have, say, 3 or 4 people applying out of a lab for the same postdoc, somebody is going to want to know like how they rank in order, right? Like who's best. But it is relatively rare for people, for like a bunch of people from the same work group to be applying for the same non-academic job. So the good news is you are far less likely to be in direct and immediate competition, right? Which is not always the case for postdocs. Now, one day, all of you in this room are going to be hiring people. And I want you to remember this day. I want you to remember being new to the job search. And I want you to remember what it's like to be rejected. I want you to craft a courteous, professional rejection, and I want you to send it promptly. I think we probably all know, having applied for a bunch of stuff, how incredibly annoying and depressing it is not to know if you've gotten something and still to be holding out hope that you actually might have gotten it. It's really a kindness and a courtesy to send a rejection when you know. Everybody you interact with may be or refer your next great employee. So I want you to treat everybody courteously and professionally at all times. One of the things that I'm not nuts about academics is its very, very strong class structure with tenured professors and PIs at the top and people, of lesser importance moving down the food chain pretty rapidly. And in academics, very, very few people can help you get a job. But in the non-academic world, lots of people can help you get a job. So it's really, really important to treat everybody well and to treat everybody as somebody who can contribute to your organization. Now, I have 3 short things to talk about, and then we can certainly open it up for any questions you might have. Here are the things that you should do right now. Do the template exercise and update it once a year. 8 hours over 3 sessions, roughly. Yearly updates after that take about half an hour. You should also re-look at the template exercise after you start reading a lot of job descriptions, because you're going to learn the jargon and you're going to say, oh yeah, here's the kinds of things I do that are like that. Join LinkedIn. Add the people you know well, add the people the template exercise bring to mind, put it on your calendar to add 2 people a week, which you should do forever. And don't add, if you don't have a resume up there now, I know many of you do, don't add it till somebody outside of academics reviews it. Create a non-academic email address if you don't already have one. Please, please, please do not create something like margaritamama@hotmail.com. You laugh. You would not believe what has crossed my desk. Clean up your contacts and keep them current. And set a regular backup schedule. So those are the things you should do immediately. Here are some resources that I think will help you. The top resources are about something that makes people very, very anxious, which is negotiating compensation. Payscale.com, their Twitter feed, and Glassdoor.com and Glassdoor.ca are all really, really good about research and negotiating compensation. Slideshare.net. Particularly those of you who are in the bench sciences or any field where you have to do posters and have to present your work on a regular basis. Slideshare.net is basically an archive of really good persuasive presentations. Now, it has recently been eaten by LinkedIn, so if you type in slideshare.net, you will be aliased over to LinkedIn to look at the presentations. But it's worth keeping an eye on what people are sort of doing visually. Careers in Gov. This is a US-based job list about careers in the public sector. And even if you are not a US citizen, I would look at this a little bit because it publishes jobs for everything from entry-level police officer to city manager. And it is worth reading them to find out what those jobs do. And what that will do is it will expand your sense of what might be applicable to you quite quickly. And you don't have to look for them. You just go on Twitter. You also don't need a Twitter account to look at this. You can just go and look. On my website, I have posts about the non-academic job search, including the ones I have linked here. It's under the tab for graduate students and postdocs. Now, because I am a former academic, there is a reading list. Ferrazzi's book, Never Eat Alone, is a book for one of the things that after compensation makes people crazy about the job search, which is networking. This is a book by somebody who is good at it and who likes it. I know many people feel they do not fall into either of those categories, but it's a smart book. Atul Gawande, the Checklist Manifesto. So this gets back to your questions about do you measure stuff in hours? A job search is a big project. And basically, this is a book about how checklists and introducing yourself and tracking things will help you complete projects at a higher level. The chapter to read that is most important is chapter 3, The End of the Master Builder. But this is the best book I know about how to complete projects. Amanda Littman, Run for Something. This is a guide that is written for folks in the US about running not only for the big offices, but for the entry-level offices, for selectmen, for the school board, for all those kinds of things. And it's about what it takes to run for public office, which interestingly is less than you think, and about engagement. Molly Weisenberg. This is a very interesting book about a woman who went to graduate school and who decided to leave and who made up a career for herself. She was a food blogger before that was a word. And she now writes the very popular blog Orangette, a food blog. She also runs a pizza joint close to me, so I'm very pleased she is in my area. And what it's about, what this book is about, is how she thought of herself and how she changed how she thought of herself as she went through life and how she decided to make up a career. And that's a possible outcome, right? And so if you're thinking about changes and you don't know sort of how to think about it, this is actually a very helpful book to read. Now, some reminders. Careers are long, and they very, very rarely follow predictable pathways. The last 3 jobs I have done did not exist when I graduated from university. And that will be true for a lot of you as well. The non-academic world is awesome. There is a lot of work out there, and it is developing, and it is cool, and it is interesting. This is maybe the most important point of this slide. Things not invented yet will create new jobs. So when I graduated from university, I went on the East Coast in the United States. I was an English major. And what English majors from East Coast schools in the United States did then is they rolled like loose marbles down to New York City, and they got jobs as copy editors at publishing houses. That was a very common career pathway. And my mother, being my mother, says, all those jobs are going away. She said this for almost every job I applied for, interestingly, which was odd. But what people who say, gosh, those jobs are going away, never add is, but new jobs are being created all the time. And here's the example. When I finally wrote my book, and it was not the academic book on 17th and 18th century British satire that my dissertation director confidently assumed I would write, but instead was a book about young women in technology workplaces and what they faced, I published it digitally first, because I didn't know if anybody would want to read the damn thing. So I published it digitally, and here are 3 people I had to hire. I had to hire someone who would create a cover for an electronic book that would look good in the micro size you're allowed on websites. I had to hire somebody who would format the interior of the book. And then I had to hire someone, I suppose I could have done this myself, but I didn't want to learn. I had to hire somebody who could format it for all the different e-readers that are out there. Because you can buy an e-book in many different ways. None of those jobs existed, not only when I left my undergraduate, but none of those jobs existed when I left graduate school, right? And those are all jobs these were full-time occupation for these people now. And that should really give you confidence, because all the folks I hired to do this had come to those careers after other careers, and they had learned their way into it, and they had adapted in the job market. And all of you have the kind of skills that are going to enable you to do this. And the reason I end with this slide, for questions and stuff, is that it is tempting to believe when you have gone to graduate school to do a particular thing, that if you don't get a job in that thing, that you have somehow failed. But actually what you have done is that you have come to graduate school not only to develop a body of knowledge and an approach to it, but an ability to adapt to how the world is changing. That, at bottom, is your core skill. And my experience with all of you is that you're going to be pretty successful in that adaptation. Now, you have now had a chance to digest all of this, and now the python is digesting the pig. So tell me what further questions you have. Yes?
I have a question about references. So my list is a little sparse at the moment since it's been a while. There's been transitions since I've been in a job. So I'll definitely be using my supervisor, at least one person on my committee, maybe two. And they're very, at least one of them is very fluent outside of academia, so should be good there. Also using someone at a nonprofit that I've been chair of the board for. I'm just wondering how creative you can get with references, or if it's a bad idea to get creative, because one person I was thinking of would be a student that I've supervised personally and worked on projects with, who's gone on to have a really successful career. And so would you advise against that? And I know she's well-spoken and would represent me really well. So I'm just wondering if that's...
No, that's totally fine. I would start assembling 3 lists of references. I would have a list of people who have supervised your work, right, who can speak to that well. I would have a list, if you have, of people you have supervised. Because especially if you're applying for entry-level management jobs, people will want to know about people who have worked for you in the past, right? And then a list of people who are your peers, right? This often happens from student organizations. So yes, you can absolutely have that kind of reference. But start mentally assembling 3 lists, basically, right? Supervisors, supervisees, and peers. Because you'll need all of them for various jobs.
We actually have a couple online questions.
Oh, so excellent. Go ahead.
Ask you those from the folks watching. So the first one here is, what if you do not have a certain qualification? Should we acknowledge that in the job interview/application, or try to avoid talking about it and focus on the skills we do have?
Sadly, the answer is it depends. And what it depends on is how critical the qualification is and what the job is. So if you're applying for work in the public sector and it requires a master's in public health and you don't have that, I mean, first of all, it's unlikely that you will get to the interview, but if you don't have what you perceive to be a basic qualification, it's going to be very hard. And if you think there's that kind of difference, the thing that's really important to do is research to find out how key the qualification is. Because if you're in an interview with a key qualification and you don't have, you probably don't belong there. And it's going to be really risky for you in the job. So try to find out how important the qualification is and if it's something you can speak to at an interview.
Excellent. And there's one more online question here.
Go ahead.
Are there cases which have discrimination in job markets based on religion? I dress myself in accordance with my religion. How do I convince employers that I am capable to do the required job?
Yeah, to the answer, is there discrimination? Absolutely. Sadly, for folks who dress in a way that is identified with a certain religion, whether it's a kippah or an abaya or whatever it is, what you will need is to rebut their suspicions. And so what that means is, if you believe that they will say, oh, because of the way I dress, I can't actually, I don't know what it, lift a certain amount or whatever it is, you have to have evidence of having done that, right? And so you can't be in that position, sadly, you can't be in a position to say, don't worry, I've done this analogous thing. It's much more helpful if you say, oh, but I've done that actual thing, right? But there will absolutely be bias, and the biases in some ways will be strong. And in some ways, they will almost be worse if people feel they actually cannot talk about them because they have them. So yeah, that's going to be hard. That's going to be consistently hard.
So you've hit LinkedIn pretty hard. So I am somebody who will be needing to go and make a shiny new profile on LinkedIn. Do you have recommendations on profile pictures? What is it like? Get a headshot photo, or because I know appearances are important.
Yeah, I know. I hate saying this. I think most people expect to find a photo I don't like it because I think it brings out many, many kinds of implicit bias. You don't need a formal headshot photo. What you need is a photo that does not bring your judgment into question. So, for example, the email address I cited of margaritamama@hotmail.com, your photo should not be, shall we say, equivalent. A casual photo is fine. Use your judgment. Now, one thing about, for those of you who have not created LinkedIn profiles before, just go claim your name, sign up and do it. But you can invite people to connect with you before you have a resume up. So don't feel you need to wait, right? Just like go and invite 10 people you know really, really well so they know it's you, right? And just start amassing your connections that way. Because partly because it's confidence building, but also because you have to start and you might as well. But yeah, you probably will need a photo, and I don't like that. But there you are. I cannot like that.
And I'll just say for all of you and everyone online that our office, the Office of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies, does run photo sessions where you can come and get your headshot done professionally here at SFU on campus. So we're going to set another one up this summer, so just look out for emails for that. So that's an option for your LinkedIn profile as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
Okay, I'm interested in what you said about using information interviews to sort of plant the seed that you're interested in working with an organization. What types of things can you do, or do you have types of questions that you can ask to sort of stand out?
Right. So the best thing to do, you can't go in with a general question. You can't go in and say, tell me what it's like to work here, right? You need to have something more specific. So if you say, I saw your company does this kind of work. I have this kind of background. Can you tell me about what this kind of work requires, right? In other words, they need to understand why you might be interested in them. Because it's not enough to say, gosh, I'm really interested in Amazon because it's just a cool company. It seems to be taking over the world, right? That is not very persuasive. But saying, hey, I've worked in logistics and I was really impressed to see that, you're now actually going into, you're actually buying airplanes. Can you tell me about that part of your business? You need to have a specific reason that you're interested in that company. And then the conversation goes where it goes. Yeah.
Again, about the references, you suggested 3 lists of references, but I don't know, how would I know which ones to use in each situation? Would I go by the skills the job is asking for, and who would know me better for those skills?
If you are able to make decisions with that level of granularity, yes, that's how you should do it. Most people actually aren't. Most people have 3 to 5 people who know them pretty well and who know their work and who can speak to it, and that's fine too. But yeah, if you're like, let's say you're applying, you've been studying one thing, but you had earlier skills in something else and you're actually applying for a job in that something else, then it's really helpful, obviously, to have somebody who knew you work in that area, right? I mean, that's an obvious case. But you want to have somebody who can speak persuasively to it. I used to run into this all the time when people would run into whoever the currently famous faculty member was, and they would talk to them at a conference for 10 minutes and then ask if they could write a letter of reference for them. And then because they say, oh, he's famous, everybody knows who he is. And it actually really isn't about that. It's really about who can speak persuasively to your work. Now, if they can speak persuasively, and then if they are a big deal in your department or whatever it is, that's helpful too. But famous name is not a helpful reference. Strong acquaintance with your work is what I'm looking for.
Does it have to be somebody who you have worked or has worked with you recently? Because, for example, in my case, I'm from Brazil. I have lots of references there, people who I have worked closely to, but I have the feeling that here in Canada, they care more about Canadian people I have worked.
Sure. Yeah, you'll need some of both. You'll probably need some of both.
Okay? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another thing is I'm from the field of education, and the jobs I know of are kind of restrictive. So I don't even, know which jobs, non-academic jobs would be available for us. And as you said, there will be new jobs, right? So you said we can search by the skill? And how do we do that?
You do that by keyword searching, right?
Google.
So, so you go, you do that exercise, you discover the skills you have best, and then, you sort of take a stab in the dark. You search for 2 skills and a job that you think might work. Like you look at, say, online publishing. You don't even know if that's a thing, but you look at online educational publishing, and then you start reading and learning, and then you say, ugh, not really this, but some of this stuff over here. It's very much analogous to research, right? Where you try a bunch of things and 90% of it doesn't work.
Oh, okay.
And then you get to 10%, and that 10% is a little more promising, and 90% of that doesn't work. And then you do a bunch of follow-up, and then you find, oh, this thing might work. Job searches are exactly like that.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just don't drop it on each other.
I guess it's a little field specific, and maybe my question is more for computer science type fields, but you didn't talk at all about forums like Stack Exchange, Stack Overflow, online presence on these sorts of things, or GitHub. I didn't even think of LinkedIn. I thought of GitHub as being kind of like a jumping board. And also, what about websites? Can you talk about all these things a little bit? Some other online presence?
Sure. So GitHub, normally if you are asked to submit a code sample, GitHub will be an absolutely normal way to ask for it. You'll also probably be asked to do a whiteboard exercise, right? Where you arrive at the company and you work in, I don't know, C++ or whatever you work in, and they say, okay, how would you solve this problem in C++? And these blah, 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 blah. And then they might say, okay, that's C++. How would you, what language, if you had anything you could choose, what language would you solve it in and why? And you'd say, well, my approach would be blah, 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 blah. But yeah, GitHub would be normal for you. If you have a website, make sure it's up to date. Make sure that if you have contact information on it, that you check it and that it's current. But other than that, it's exactly like every other kind of online presence, whether it's, Facebook or like anywhere you appear, right? That's what matters. Yeah. No, it's completely fine. More folks.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about group interviews, if it's something that's common, or if I've been part of a group interview one time and I didn't like it, so I'm just wondering if you have any tips to share about it.
So in my experience, big group interviews are pretty rare. I used to do them a lot as an academic, and they were so annoying. So what is much more common now is sometimes you will have a pair of people or 3 people. This is particularly the case if you have new managers or new interviews where like somebody will clearly be learning. What is most common is when you go to interview for a job is 3 to 5 interviews. You'll almost always interview with the hiring manager, like maybe 2 other people who are in the same team, and then somebody from HR. But big group interviews are pretty rare. And one of the reasons they're rare, actually, is that they're expensive. Like to get 4 or 5 people together for an hour to all have the same hour is hard to do. I mean, look how hard it is now.
It was more about like when there are different people applying for the same job, and I don't know if it's group interview, where different people, like 5 people who have all applied for that.
Oh, I see. Where you have a bunch of people interview. Yeah, that's really rare. And one reason, thankfully, and one reason it's really rare is that it brings up all kinds of issues about selective biases, right? And so the only situation I have ever heard of that a sort of competitive runoff interview like that is at the finals for a Rhodes Scholarship. I've literally never seen it in my world. And it's not something I would allow any of my people to do because just the opportunities for bias are just everywhere and horrible. Yeah, if you run into it, like, that wouldn't be a good sign for me.
they didn't tell me before, I wouldn't have gone. So
yeah, I would find that to be not good.
Thank you. Yeah, my second question is regarding sometimes for the online application, they ask you to say your expectations for salary.
For a salary, yeah. Fortunately, the landscape is changing a little bit, so soon I think that will become less common. But here's what you must do. You must do a lot of research. And so once you get to that level of applying for a job, you have to do research at either glassdoor.ca or PayScale or whatever, because many people do ask that question, and you have to know three things. What is the range of pay for that job? What is the range of pay for that job where you are applying, right? Because some cities are more expensive to live in some small towns, and pay scales take that into account. And then third, where does your level of qualification bring you in the range of pay? So for example, if a starting salary is $60,000 to $80,000, right, that's a pretty wide range. And so you need to be able to make a case where, okay, you call for all these kinds of qualifications. I have those and I have this experience, so I should be in the top third of that range, right, which is what you would put down. But it is all about research ahead of time. You have to know the range for the geography where you're applying, and where you fall in the range. That's the core requirement. And women always ask for too little. Always. Just keep that in mind.
Hi, so I have a question about interviewing for research positions. So as most of us will be doing that. So if it's a research position, I expect to have some kind of freedom to carry out research, right? But then companies have their own agenda, and then I find it's a little bit tricky to ask that question directly. So do you have any suggestions about how to ask that question?
Right. So it depends a lot on how confidential their work is, right? And this ranges from the extraordinary confidentiality associated with military stuff, for example, to the proprietary confidentiality of, say, biotech and medical research. The way you typically ask about this is you ask about if they have. The way I ask such questions is, how do you decide when to pursue a new project? Because what that tells you is what their criteria are. And you want them to articulate the choice criteria of, is it new in the marketplace, or is it high margin so we can fund these other experimental research projects, or, you know, or do we think we need to put out a competitor's product to this other thing that's about to go generic, or whatever it is. But how you choose new projects is generally how I ask that without asking it.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
It's an important question, sadly.
I have a question. I guess it's specifically about Amazon, because like I interviewed there like 2 years ago. So like I felt like I did really well in the phone interview, and then I got booked for like 3 or 4 in-person consecutive interviews. And I felt like I did really well in the first one, but then after that, I felt like they were just kind of repeating the same behavioral questions, and I don't know, am I supposed to talk about the same things, or
Sounds like the interview was badly run. It sounds like the interview was badly run, which sadly happens. So if the question is, how do you handle an interview where the same questions seem to keep coming up? If it happens more than once, right, because what should happen, I say this as someone who bar raised at Amazon for many years, what should happen is that each interviewer should briefly talk to the previous interviewer, like, what did you go over? Did you not get to this? Okay, I'll follow up with her, right? That clearly didn't happen. So what I would say is, after the first time someone repeats somebody else, what I would say is, oh, that's interesting. The first interviewer and the second interviewer asked a version of that question. Here's what I told them. Were you interested in something else? Right? And it's hard to have that much presence of mind when you're under stress in an interviewer and was like, oh my God, did I say something wrong the first time? I'll just repeat myself. But the thing to do is to ask, like, oh, okay, I addressed that with them, and here's basically what I said. Do you need another take on this, or did I not answer it the first time? You know, you can be exoskeletal about the interview in that way. But honestly, it sounds to me like they just screwed up. And that happens, right? There's such a thing as a bad day at the office, and that can include a bad interview on both sides. Sorry, that sucks.
How early in your cover letter should you be talking about your academic history? You're applying for a non-academic job.
You may not want to be talking about it at all. I mean, when you write a cover letter, what you're saying to an employer is, you know, dear employer, I read with great interest the job posting for X at Y location. I'm excited about this job for reasons, right? And your academic background may not come into it at all and probably shouldn't be referenced directly, except when you say things like, one of the reasons I've been interested in this is that I've pursued related research at so-and-so's lab here at blah university, right? Things like that. But unlike a CV, where you are asserting that you have the relevant academic qualifications, because that's what a CV does, right? In a resume, that's much more in question, because the question is not what university did you go to. The question is your experience related and relevant to what I need from this job, right? So it may not be the university that itself comes up. Okay. Other questions?
I have an oddly specific question, which is one of the things that you said was a good idea was to look up your interviewers on LinkedIn.
Uh-huh.
I just recently joined LinkedIn, and I realized like it tells people that you looked at their profiles, which is kind of funny. Mm-hmm. So should you do it when you're already logged in so they know you've looked at their profile, or?
So yes, yeah, I know that's a little sort of creepy stalkerish.
Yeah.
What I would say is that especially if you've been invited to an interview, that fact will not be a secret to your interviewers because they're going to show up and you're going to be there. So the fact that you're looking at them is this is not unusual creepy stalker behavior. Okay. And in fact, it is probably part of research, because if I were saying, oh, let's look at Expedia, what are they doing online? Who's in their tax department? And then you go down and look. That's okay. You know, I mean, what you don't want to do is, you don't want to do behavior where you are perceived to cross the line between personal and professional. You know, you don't want to do it for former romantic interests and things like that. You know, that's creepy. Yeah. But no, looking up people on LinkedIn is pretty standard.
Okay. Thanks.
Would you recommend getting the paid version of LinkedIn if you're... Okay.
No, I haven't found it really helpful. I mean, you know, it tells you who looked you up, which can be sort of, it can be interesting in a sort of semi-voyeuristic way, but it's also very rarely relevant, because honestly, a lot of searches happen by accident, right? Like you clicked on somebody you didn't mean to look on, and that counts as a click at you, but if they clicked away immediately, like it's not like it's a relevant piece of information, you know what I mean? Oh, the other thing about LinkedIn is that people ask if they should try to get those recommendations and stuff like that. Total clickbait. Completely ignore it. If people do it, that's lovely. But the thing about LinkedIn recommendations is because they are not private and can be seen by anybody and can be solicited, I don't take them particularly seriously. So you can, yeah, the endorsements. Feel absolutely free to ignore it. Totally. I'm sure there are some who do, but I think most don't for the reasons I talk about. You know, I think it's 99% clickbait. Yeah. Yes?
I got the sense from this presentation that you're treating CVs as explicitly relevant for academic positions and using resumes more for non-academic positions. In my experience of applying for non-academic positions, I often find that they ask, like, send us your CV. So how would you?
Yes, so what I would do, yes, and sometimes the term of art, particularly in Canada, is CV. I would make sure that you write what I call a resume and send that. Because in my experience, people who leave graduate school have, whether they consciously realize it or not, shaped their CV to be academic-ish, right? It's filled with conferences, it's filled with publications, it's in reverse order, and it doesn't, it's not selective at all. But, and I have gotten CVs for non-academic jobs that are 7 pages long. Like, how can I tell what's relevant, right? And frankly, the fact that somebody is making me do it means I'm not going to do it. So assume that what you have created is something for a non-academic employer, and then if they call that a CV, send that.
About Facebook and Instagram, for example, even if they are completely private, all the configurations, a couple of questions, like, do employers look at them? I suppose they do, but what is happening currently? Are they able to get into your private account? I mean, what can they find out? What I mean?
A very, very few look. Most don't care. Many actively do not want to know. So where I think you run into issues on Facebook is if people exhibit the kind of judgment that makes them worry about hiring you. So there's one case I know about where a young woman I know applied for a job with a religiously affiliated organization. And one of the tenets of this organization was around the use of alcohol. And, and she published about, a spring break she had attended with, silly drinks with umbrellas in them and things like that. And it's like, your employer is probably not going to love that, right? Now, can they get into private stuff? No. That behavior, at least in the United States, is restricted by law. So if you've made certain things private, they will not be getting there. But the 99% case is that most employers don't have time to look at that, and most don't have the interest, right? The exception is employment in the public sector for comments about your particular job. So if you go and you're involved, and the RCMP hires you, and they look at your posts and you have a history of antagonistic posts to law enforcement, right? That's not going to work for them, right? But except for those use cases, there is so much social media out there now that it like people couldn't look at all that stuff even if they wanted to, right?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so mostly it's not a thing.
Any de-stressing technique for having better interviews, like saying something funny at the beginning as icebreaker?
So the thing about humor, and I actually have a very interesting anecdote about this from UBC. The thing about humor is that it's incredibly culturally specific. And it's really hard to know what the cultural assumptions are of everybody in the room. So my advice is not to go there. And I'll tell you an example. I was just out to dinner last night with folks from both UBC and SFU. And one of the UBC women recounted some advice that a Hollywood person had come in to do a panel. And she had said, women should feel, that it's okay to swear. Because, in Hollywood, people expect that kind of salty language. And I would never give that advice because I think it's really hard to know, even if it's okay in that work environment, like what are people's assumptions about interviewees, right? Or what if the one person who's there who hasn't felt comfortable speaking up actually doesn't like it when people swear like that? Or what if there's one older man in the interview loop who has an inbred feeling that, young women shouldn't swear, right? My father, who swore like a sailor, thought that. It's very hard to know that stuff. So you're better erring on the side of professionalism as a general rule, because I think it's just so hard to know how things are going to be perceived culturally. Yes?
Yeah, for some jobs, the first screening is done by algorithms. It's actually not a person doing the first step. You didn't mention that at all. Do you have any thought on that?
So I often get the question of how can I beat the algorithm? How can I get my resume past the algorithm? And my experience suggests that you should not try. You should not try to do that. You should not try to defeat the algorithm. Partly because algorithms change, but also because, in my experience, if you do all the work to describe yourself well and accurately, you're going to apply for stuff that you're actually reasonable for, right? And so I think what a lot of people use algorithms for are those nightmare applicants who apply for 200 things because they're incredibly stressed about not having a job. And so they apply for everything that's conceivably out there, whether they're suited to it or not. So what algorithms do is they cut out the first wad of applications that are just like, I don't know why this person thought they couldn't do it, right? It specified a bachelor's degree, they don't have one. Fook. All that kind of stuff. So I would not try the beat the algorithm game. The thing that I think is worth doing is reading a lot of job descriptions so you understand how people are currently talking about skills, because that has something to do with how they're formulating that. And you may have those skills or you may not, but using the current words to describe them, I think, is probably valuable. But in general, beat the algorithm is not a...
I wasn't thinking of beating it,
right.
just being cautious of putting in certain keywords or avoiding others or making sure there's no special character because those may not be recognized. All these
Right. Yeah. Well, and so I think one point about that is that lots of resumes are machine read these days. So, avoiding things like, for example, an ampersand, right? Avoiding special characters or being aware that if your name has characters that are not common, native to English, that if you have, umlauts or other things or, symbols from, lower CDs from Polish or something like that, make sure that you test machine screen it. That, I think, is worth doing. But other than that, just ignore the algorithms. All right. So it's been a while since I've been in graduate school, but I do want to say that I remember that one of the hardest things to do in graduate school was to find an hour, and you have all been gracious enough to give me 3. So thank you so much for that. All right, bye-bye.
And a big thanks for Anne for making the trek up here from Seattle, but still had to cross the border. We really appreciate your time. And as she mentioned at the beginning, she will be sending us the materials from today, so I will send all those out to you. If you are here and you didn't RSVP, just send me an email. If you don't have my email address, it's just on the Grad Studies website. But I think most of you probably RSVP'd on mine, so I have your email addresses, and I'll just send out all that information.
Cool.
Alrighty.
All right. Cool.
Awesome.
Good. They're good questions.
Perfect time.